Chapter 41. When Fong stood up and went home, his face was still a little confused. With his wood-like brain, he still couldn't figure out what was so good about those unripe and sour red fruits that he didn't like to eat. Why did the son-in-law want him to pick those things? As for the reason why he wanted him to chop the bamboo, old Fong couldn't figure it out. But soon, the confusion and bewilderment on his face disappeared. Thinking about the white rice and pork at home, all of old Fong's doubts were thrown out the window. The son-in-law was very capable. If he followed the son-in-law, he would have meat to eat. His words couldn't be wrong. In the following days, Fong's life began to become busy. Not only Fong, but also the naughty children of the Fong family were ruthlessly deprived of their time to play. They could no longer follow the naughty children in the stockade every day. They followed their father, went to the back mountain in the morning and came back in the afternoon, often carrying a few bamboo sticks on their shoulders. Occasionally, people would see Fong go down the mountain before dawn every day and return to the stockade at night with a big bag of things on his back. He didn't even let go of the horse. No one knew what he was doing mysteriously. There was no impenetrable wall in the world. In the Willow Leaf Village, no one had any secrets to speak of. Soon, everyone knew that the thing Fong Lao-san was playing with was called candied haws. It was a kind of hawthorn fruit that could be put together and sold outside. Hawthorn was not valuable to the people of the Willow Leaf Village. There was a large hawthorn forest in the back mountain, which was the public property of the stockade. However, even if the fruits were ripe every year, no one would pick them. They were sour, and the more they ate, the hungrier they got. If they ate too much, their teeth would fall out. Only those greedy naughty children would pick a few every year when the fruits were ripe to satisfy their cravings. It wasn't that no one had considered selling the hawthorn at the foot of the mountain, but firstly, hawthorn was too common and cheap. Secondly, hawthorn ripened during the busy farming season. If they abandoned their work in the fields and walked these crooked paths instead, they would be ridiculed by everyone in the village. Fong was the object of everyone's ridicule. What was so good about hawthorn fruits? Only the ignorant children in the stockade village were interested in them. There was nothing good to eat or play in Qing and Prefectural City. It would be strange if anyone would spend money to buy these hawthorn fruits. Herding horses was a good job. Every month, he could earn 100 copper coins. It was enough for him to buy a few caddies of rice. Why didn't he have to resort to such dishonest means? However, they soon realized that Fong Lao-san's family did not lack those few caddies of rice, but this did not affect the mockery they felt towards Fong. When everyone didn't have any lofty ideals or ambitions and just wanted to be a salted fish for the rest of their lives, Fong, a salted fish with dreams, would easily attract the attention of others. We're all salted fish. It's good enough for us to face the yellow soil and face the sky for the rest of our lives. What right do you have to dream? As a result, Fong, the salted fish that wanted to be reborn, quickly became the topic of conversation among the people in the village. Did you guys hear? Fong Lao-san seems to be selling some candied haws, dishonest means. Doesn't he know if he's cut out for it? Sigh, of course Fong Lao-san wouldn't have thought of this idea. I heard that it was Rui's husband who came up with it. Hee, what does that scholar know? I heard that he invested a lot of money this time. I'll wait and see how he ends up. Arguments like this were not uncommon in the middle level of Willow Leaf Village. Even Li Yi had heard of it. However, he just listened to these gossips and laughed it off. There were many people in the village who wanted to see him make a fool of himself. Sometimes he would sigh in his heart. Lu Rui and her sister seemed to have enemies everywhere in the village. Xiao Huan, on the other hand, was very indignant about some of the words she accidentally heard. Li Yi had seen her pouting and nagging when she came back from outside several times. What do you know? The candied haws made by the son-in-law are very delicious. He will definitely make a lot of money. Then you guys will die of anger. The little maid had been with Lu's sister Rui since she was a child. Naturally, she had been treated coldly by other people of the Lu family. In order not to cause trouble for Miss Rui, she had been wronged outside and could only endure it when she came back. This situation changed a lot after Li Yi came. Now, they didn't have to worry about their livelihood all day long. They could walk with their heads held high outside. The son-in-law was a really powerful person. No one in the village could compare with him. What right did they have to laugh at the son-in-law? What Li Yi didn't expect was that those rumors had no effect on him, but Fang couldn't help it. Son-in-law, will there really be people willing to buy this candied haws? Until now, Fang still had doubts about the feasibility of this matter. After all, it was just an ordinary hawthorn. Even if it was covered with sugar, it was still a hawthorn. The son-in-law had given him all the money. If all the money went to waste in the end, even if the son-in-law didn't blame him, he would feel bad. Seeing that Fang was looking at him with a perturbed expression, Li Yi glanced at him and said, "If you don't feel at ease, why don't I find someone else to do it? Old Wu came to find me this morning and said that he wants to try too. Why don't you rest and let him do it?" Looking at the expression on Li Yi's face, Fang felt at ease. The next moment, Fang's face immediately changed into his signature honest smile. He put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder and said, there's no need. Old Wu has a one-track mind. He's not the type to do this. Besides, what kind of relationship do I have with the son-in-law? Don't forget that I was the one who captured the son-in-law." Seeing the burly man with the surname Fang walk out with a smile, several black lines appeared on Li Yi's face. It was very easy to make candied hawthorns and didn't require much preparation time. Fang had already bought the icing from the foot of the mountain. The August hawthorns were not fully ripe yet, but it didn't affect the taste much. Under Li Yi's guidance, Fang cut all the bamboo from the mountain into bamboo sticks of similar size. The edges were polished smooth and the bottom of the bamboo stick was slightly wider, making it more suitable to hold. After the hawthorns were seeded and coated in the syrup, he dipped a little sesame seed on the top. There was a little white in the middle, making it look even more attractive. He stuck all of the candied hawthorns on wooden sticks and brooms. Seeing the naughty child beside him gulping down his saliva, Fang felt a little more confident. He took down a candied hawthorn and handed it to him. He conveniently kicked the naughty child's butt and said, "Listen to your mother at home. Wait for me to come back tonight." 2 hours later, on the crowded main street of Qing'an Prefecture, the simple and honest man carried a strange object and stood by the side of the road. He hesitated for a long time before a resolute expression appeared on his face. A moment later, a voice full of energy traveled over. "Ice candied gourd." For a moment, several gazes were cast over from the crowd on the street. Chapter 42. Candied haws. What is that? I don't know, I've never heard of it before. Let's go and take a look. The term, candied haws, was undoubtedly a new term to the people of this world. With a curious mentality, the pedestrians on the street all looked in the direction of the voice. They saw a burly man standing in a corner of the street, holding a long object in his hand. The top of the object was densely packed with something. Looking closely, those things that were the size of abacus beads were strung together. Weren't they just ordinary red fruits? Even if the red fruit was covered with a layer of crystal clear stuff and sprinkled with sesame seeds, it couldn't change the fact that it was a red fruit. "Hey, man, how much are you selling this ice something gourd?" A young man in a long robe came forward and asked. 5 copper coins for a skewer." The simple and honest man immediately replied. 5 copper coins? The young man was stunned at first, then he shook his head and left. Red fruits were not rare. One could buy a few caddies of them on the street for 1 copper coin. Only a fool would spend 5 copper coins for just a few of them. I thought it was some rare item, but it's just a few red fruits. 5 copper coins for a skewer. This man really dares to ask for a price. TSK, there's nothing to see, let's go. When he saw the crowd that had been attracted by his first call quickly disappear, the heart of the man surnamed Fang could not help but sink. The thing that he was most worried about had happened. "Here's 5 copper coins, give me a skewer." A voice came from the side. The man surnamed Fang turned his head and saw a middle-aged scholar in navy blue robes. He took out 5 copper coins from his chest pocket and placed them in his hand. This was his first customer. The burly man was overjoyed and hurriedly put the money away. He took a skewer of candied haws and handed it over. "Your candied haws." The scholar reached out and took it, then left. The burly man, who wanted to get his evaluation, felt a little disappointed. After all, he didn't want everything he had done for the past few days to be in vain. In a place where the burly man's surnamed Fong couldn't see, the middle-aged scholar took a bite of the sugar-coated haws, and a trace of surprise flashed across his face. He lowered his head to look at the sugar-coated haws in his hand and murmured, "There's sweetness in the sour, crispy and delicious. I really didn't expect that red fruits could be made in such a novel way." Because he was a little hungry, he bought a snack that he had never seen before on a whim, but it gave him a different kind of surprise. A smile appeared on the middle-aged scholar's face, and his mood seemed to improve a little. He continued to walk forward. At this moment, the burly man surnamed Fong, who had just completed his first transaction, had a glimmer of hope in his heart. He raised his head and shouted at the top of his lungs. "Candied haws, delicious candied haws, candied haws, it's free if it's not sweet." After an hour, the man with the surname Fong, whose voice had become somewhat hoarse from all the shouting, leaned against the wall in an extremely discouraged manner. The trace of hope in his heart had also been mercilessly destroyed. Up until now, his second skewer of candied haws had not been sold. It had to be said that the shape of the candied haws was very peculiar, and it attracted many people to inquire about it. However, when they saw that the so-called candied haws were just a few red fruits strung together, and the price was actually 5 copper coins, they all lost interest. "Should I try selling it for 1 copper coin a skewer first?" Fong muttered to himself somewhat helplessly. However, when he remembered that the son-in-law had warned him before he left that a skewer of candied haws could not be less than 5 copper coins, he could only give up on this idea. On the street, a little further away from the burly man surnamed Fong, a mischievous child of about 5 or 6 years old was hugging a woman's thigh and wailing incessantly. "Be good, mother will make delicious food for you when we get back," the woman helplessly said as she looked at her child who was suddenly making a scene. No matter how hard she tried to coax him, she could not calm him down. "No, I want to eat it now." The mischievous child was obviously not that easy to fool. He hugged her thigh and shook his head vigorously. The mischievous child, who had long since figured out his mother's routine, knew that what awaited him when he returned home was definitely not delicious food, but a vicious beating as punishment for his disobedience. Rather than foolishly waiting to be beaten when he returned home, he might as well pester his mother for some benefits. This way, it would be worth it even if he was beaten when he returned home. The mischievous child who was making a scene on the street quickly attracted the attention of passers-by. The woman also felt a little embarrassed when she was stared at by so many people. She wanted to calm the child down first, and then slowly educate him when they returned home. However, she suddenly realized that the crying beside her had stopped. She looked down and discovered that the mischievous child was staring straight ahead. He swallowed his saliva, pointed in the direction of the corner of the street, and said, "Mother, I want that." After a moment, the mischievous child, who had tasted his desire, left while licking the candied haws in satisfaction. He was extremely fond of this delicacy that he had never tasted before. After finishing all of the hawthorns, he licked the sugar off the bamboo stick, but he was reluctant to throw it away. He carefully put it away, and even licked the residue from the corner of his mouth. He was filled with joy, thinking that he would definitely tell a few of his close friends when he returned home. He did not notice that the woman beside him had a rather unpleasant expression on her face. The first thing he would be greeted with when he returned home was a vicious beating. After 2 whole hours, he had only sold 2 candied haws. Fong's heart was already in complete despair. "This time, I'm afraid the young master is going to be disappointed." After letting out a long sigh, the man with the surname Fong picked up the stick with the candied haws and prepared to return home. He had only taken a few steps when he suddenly heard a flurry of footsteps behind him. In the next moment, he discovered that he had been surrounded. The people surrounding Fong were a group of mischievous children. The oldest among them was only 10 years old, and they all looked at Fong with excited gazes. the candied haws in his hands. The mischievous child standing at the very front was about 5 or 6 years old. Fong had just met him. He was the one who had taken care of his second business. The mischievous child covered his butt with one hand, and the tears on his face had yet to dry. He pointed at the skewers of candied haws and said, "This is the one. Whether I lied to you or not, you'll know soon enough." After saying that, the mischievous child stretched out his small hand and revealed the 5 copper coins in his palm. He said loudly, "Uncle, I want a skewer of candied haws." "Me too. Me too. I want 2 skewers." The mischievous children chattered one after another. Fong looked at the fair and clean little hands that were stretched out, and his expression was a little dazed. On the street, a girl passing by was puzzled as she watched a group of excited naughty kids rushing past her. Each of them was holding a skewer of food and eating deliciously. When she looked ahead, she saw a burly man carrying a strange stick. The strength of the mischievous children could not be underestimated. A small portion of the candied haws disappeared in an instant, and was replaced by a large pile of copper coins in his pocket. "Excuse me, how much is this?" Just as Fong was standing there in a daze, a pleasant voice came from the side. Seeing the incomparably delicate young girl standing next to him, the man with the surname Fong couldn't help but blush. He said, Five copper coins. All right, give me one." The young girl nodded and said with a smile. She took a small bite, and her mouth was instantly filled with a sweet and sour taste. The young girl's beautiful eyes slightly brightened. She took out a small piece of silver from her beautiful pouch and pointed at the remaining candied haws. "I want all of these." Chapter 43. Fong had brought around 30 skewers of candied haws with him today. Half of them had been bought by the naughty children, and there were still around a dozen left. It was obvious that the young girl couldn't carry them all by herself. After the young girl paid, Fong took the initiative to help her deliver them to the place. With so many copper coins in his pocket, it felt heavy and made him feel very at ease. At this moment, Fong couldn't help but feel ashamed for doubting his son-in-law's thoughts. "Uncle, how are these candied haws made?" The young girl walked in front with a skewer of candied haws in her hand. She gently licked the sugar coating and guessed that it was frosting, but she wasn't sure. She turned her head and asked in confusion. "Miss, I can't tell you that." Fong laughed foolishly. He didn't reveal the method of making the candied haws just because the young girl was beautiful. Fong wasn't that stupid. This was something he would use to make his family rich in the future. How could he just casually tell others? Hearing Fong's answer, the young girl was stunned for a moment. After a while, she also realized that her question was a bit inappropriate. She smiled apologetically and said, "Sorry, I forgot that this is Uncle's secret recipe. I shouldn't have asked." Fong laughed foolishly and didn't reply. He followed behind the young girl and walked through the noisy street. He didn't know when it started, but the crowd started to thin out. The buildings on both sides also gradually became more luxurious. There was a row of red doors with mighty stone lions in front of them. It was extremely extravagant. To buy a stronghold here, it would probably cost a lot of money. Fong muttered to himself. He also began to wonder about the identity of the young girl. After all, the people who could live here were either rich or noble. They weren't people ordinary people like them could come into contact with. "It's here." Not long after, the young girl stopped walking. She turned around and smiled at the man surnamed Fong. "Wait here for a moment. I'll go in and come out immediately." Fong nodded and watched the young girl walk through the 10 feet tall door. The 2 servants at the door bent over and said something. Because he was too far away, he couldn't hear clearly. Not long after, the young girl's figure appeared again. 4 young girls followed behind her, each holding a tray in their hands. They walked to the front of the burly man surnamed Fong and looked at the strings of crystal-clear candied haws. The young girl on the left asked curiously, "Sister Yenji, what is this?" "Don't ask too much. I'll tell you later. First, pluck these candied haws." The girls looked at Fong with puzzled eyes, then looked at the candied haws one by one. He couldn't throw away the stick he was carrying on his shoulder. By the time these girls took all the candied haws off the tree, Fong's mission had been completed. Before he left, he heard one of the girls muttering, "Isn't this just a red fruit? What's so rare about it?" As for what happened after that, Fong was not in the mood to listen. He just wanted to go back to the stockade village and start making the next batch of candied haws, at this time, in the backyard of an extremely luxurious mansion in Anqing Prefecture City. Who would have thought that a mere red fruit could be made so delicious? A young girl licked her lips, as if she hadn't had enough. Her action was extremely seductive. "You actually doubted me just now." The young girl named Yenji glanced at her and said, "Hee, it's all my fault." "Thank you, Sister Yenji." The young girl shook her arm in a fawning manner and said with a smile, "It's strange. These are just ordinary red fruits. How can there be such a big difference in the taste?" A young girl said doubtfully, "It should be because of the layer of icing on the outside. This candied haws shouldn't be difficult to make. We can try it in the future." The young girl named Yenji thought for a moment and said. Although she didn't ask for the method of making it, it wasn't hard to guess. After all, other than the red fruit, there was only a layer of sweetness on the outside of the candied haws. It seemed like the icing had melted and then wrapped around it. "Yenji, what are you doing here?" A gentle voice suddenly came from behind them. The young girls turned their heads and saw a beautiful woman walking over with the support of two servant girls. The woman had a beautiful face. Although the crow's feet at the corner of her eyes betrayed her age, her charm didn't diminish. It was just that her face was a little haggard and thin. Her face was also abnormally pale. "Princess," seeing this woman, the young girls stood up in a panic. They were also a little nervous. They were the servants of the prince's mansion. If they were to gather here, it would be easy to think that they were slacking off. "Princess, why did you come out? The wind is strong outside. You should go back quickly." The young girl named Yenji had a worried expression on her face. She hurriedly walked over and supported the woman as she spoke. The beautiful woman shook her head and said, "It's fine. It's so stuffy to stay in the room. It's good to come out for a walk." After speaking, her eyes inadvertently glanced behind the young girls. On the stone table, there was a string of red and crystal clear things. She walked over and asked curiously, "What is this?" The young girl closest to her quickly wiped the corner of her mouth and said respectfully, "Princess, this is called candied haws." "Candied haws?" The woman asked again, "What is this thing used for?" "Princess, this is a snack that Yenji bought on the street." The young girl named Yenji came forward and said. The woman nodded and picked up a stick of candied haws. After looking at it, she said, "It's crystal clear and looks good." She then took a bite. The sweet and sour taste made her mouth water. She then said, "It's delicious." Seeing the woman finish the stick of candied haws, all the young girls couldn't help but widen their eyes. Especially the young girl named Yenji, a look of surprise appeared on her pretty face. As the personal maid of the princess, she certainly knew that the princess had been feeling unwell these days. She could hardly eat anything. Occasionally, she would eat something, but she would quickly spit it out. As a result, she had lost a lot of weight. Many doctors had been invited, but they were all useless. Even the specially invited imperial doctors were helpless. After so many days, this was the first time she had seen the princess eat so happily. "Why do I feel even hungrier after eating all this?" After eating the candied haws in her hand, the woman had a look of confusion on her face. She said, "Yenji, tell the kitchen to make some food and send it to the room later." "Yes, princess, I'll go right away." The young girl's face was even more surprised. After responding, she immediately trotted away. A moment later, in the study of the manor, the middle-aged man who was reading in the room suddenly stood up when he heard the servant's report. With a face full of joy, he said, "What did you say? Princess can eat now?" The young girl nodded and said, "Yes, the princess took the initiative to ask the kitchen to make food. Sister Yenji said that the princess ate a lot tonight. Quick, take me to see the princess. The middle-aged man laughed and strode out of the room after his beloved wife's stubborn illness was cured. At the same time, Fong also strode into Li Yi's house. Clatter. Piling up a large pile of copper coins on the table in front of him, Fong laughed and said, "Young master, all the candied haws have been sold." Previously, he only earned 100 copper coins a month. Today, in just a short time, it was equivalent to his monthly income. Fong was extremely happy. Now we don't have to worry about whether Zhuzi can get a wife or not, do we? This result was within Li Yi's expectation, so he said with a smile. Lao Fong laughed heartily and said with lofty sentiments, "Don't worry. If we make money in the future, we can also learn from those rich people and live in big houses, marry a few concubines, and live a comfortable life." The big houses that he saw today had obviously completely stimulated Fong, and even his life goals had been raised a lot. It seemed that he was shocked by Fong's lofty ideals. Li Yi's smile froze on his face. After a while, he sighed, stood up, patted Fong on the shoulder, and turned away without saying a word. "Young master, what's wrong?" Li Yi's actions puzzled the man with the surname Fong. Just as he was about to ask, he seemed to have sensed something. He turned his head abruptly and saw a familiar face appear behind him. However, at this time, this familiar face was extremely gloomy. Who else could it be but his wife? "Fool, what did you just say?" In just a moment, the broom in Li Yi's house was in Madame Fong's hand. What a sin! Li Yi stood in the courtyard and heard the screams coming from the room. He sighed deeply. Chapter 44. Li Yi really couldn't see it. Fong, who usually looked very gentle, could turn into a tough woman in a second. She waved the broom vigorously in her hand. Fong had a body full of skills, but at this moment, he couldn't use any of them. He could only cover his head and flee like a rat. Li Yi, who was standing in the courtyard, happened to catch a glimpse of Madame Fong's ferocious scene inside the house, and he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. If you're not from the same family, you're from the same family. Old Fong's family probably all have Super Saiyan genes and can complete a gorgeous transformation in an instant. Half an hour later, Li Yi waved a palm leaf fan in his hand and leisurely sat under a tree at the entrance to enjoy the cool breeze. Opposite him, the bruised and swollen face of the burly man surnamed Fong looked at him with a bitter expression. "Son-in-law, you are not kind." Fong held back for a long time before saying this. Obviously, he was still brooding over the fact that Li Yi didn't remind him just now. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't say anything. You asked for it." Being stared at by this guy with big eyes, Li Yi always felt like he was being stared at by a dog. He hurriedly waved his hand and said. It was obviously Fong who had a cheap mouth. This kind of thing couldn't be blamed on him. Fong opened his mouth and found that he was speechless. He carefully thought about what Li Yi said and suddenly felt that what he said was very reasonable. It was him who said to live in a big house, and it was him who said to marry a concubine. Fortunately, he didn't say that he would divorce his mother-in-law at that time. Otherwise, how could he still stand here and talk to the son-in-law now? He could probably only nag a few words when he offered incense every year. Fong didn't want to talk about the sad past. Thinking about how popular the candied haws was, he was ecstatic and said, "You're right. This candied haws is really a good way to make money. It's much better than herding horses in the stockade." Li Yi looked at Fong with disdain. Up until now, Fong was still thinking about buying a big house and marrying a concubine. Perhaps even in his next life, he would not be able to realize this dream. "Son-in-law, what should we do next?" Previously, Li Yi had said that today was just a small experiment. Fong couldn't wait to ask. Even good wine was afraid of a deep alley. If he wanted to sell candied haws in this world, it was obviously not enough for Fong to carry a stick and sell them on the street alone. Li Yi needed more manpower. Go and ask everyone who else is willing to participate in this matter. We need more people. Li Yi thought about it and said. Li Yi originally wanted to let people who were close to Lu's sister Rui participate. For them, this was definitely beneficial and not harmful. It was enough to change their lives. Although they wouldn't become rich overnight, they wouldn't have to worry about food and clothing. However, he didn't want to force others. This matter still needed to be decided by them. Do you still need to ask? Only a fool wouldn't do something to make money. Fong rolled his eyes, patted his chest and said, "Don't worry, son-in-law. Leave this matter to me." In his opinion, those who didn't want to make money were fools. It was difficult to even fill their stomachs while guarding the small piece of land at home, not to mention marrying a concubine and living in a big house. Good things should not flow to outsiders. Of course, Fong went to find his brothers who were familiar with him. In this era, it was undoubtedly very difficult for farmers who had been working in the fields all their lives to accept a new thing. In their eyes, only land and food were tangible and tangible things. However, since it was the son-in-law who asked, almost everyone agreed without any hesitation. After all, he was the man who gave their whole family a full meal. This kind of kindness was not to say that they would go through water and tread on fire, but when Li Yi needed them, they would definitely stand up. Although there were still some doubts and apprehensions in their hearts, everyone chose to believe. When old Fong showed him what he had gained on the first day, his apprehension vanished like smoke in thin air. To be able to earn a net profit of 100 copper coins in a day, for them, this kind of speed that was like robbing money was undoubtedly very attractive. That night, everyone was busy. A few women washed the hawthorns overnight and boiled them into a sugar paste. Fong and the others skewered the hawthorns and coated them in the sugar paste. Finally, they sprinkled some stir-fried sesame seeds on top. The next day, when the sun had just risen, they hurried down the mountain. Naturally, the movement of so many people could not be hidden from others. The plump lady Wu stood at the door of her house and watched as Master Fong and the others carried strange sticks out of the stockade. She curled her lips and said in a small voice, "A group of idiots. Sooner or later, they will be killed by that poor scholar." In a very luxurious mansion in the Qing and prefectural city, the atmosphere today was different from usual. It was very jubilant. The servant girls and manservants who walked around the mansion all received double the usual amount of money. Everyone had smiles on their faces and even their steps were much lighter than usual. Do you have anything you want to eat today? I will immediately order the kitchen to make it." In a wide hall, a middle-aged man dressed in luxurious clothing smiled as he spoke to the beautiful woman beside him. The woman looked at the table full of delicious food in front of her and smiled helplessly. She said, "Your Highness, there is no need to trouble yourself. This is already enough. Ro has lost a lot of weight these days. I will send someone to deliver some tonics." The middle-aged man stroked the beautiful woman's pretty face and said with some heartache. The beautiful woman's face couldn't help but blush. She looked up at the young man opposite her and said in a small voice, "Xian, is still here." The young man opposite them coughed dryly and said, "Father, mother, I didn't see anything." Hearing his words, the beautiful woman snorted and laughed. Then, as if remembering something, she said, "I don't really want to eat the other dishes, but I do miss the taste of the candied hawthorns from yesterday." The middle-aged man glared at the young man who was engrossed in eating. "What are you spacing out for? Didn't you hear what your mother said? Hurry up and buy the candied hawthorns." "Yes, father." It was quite awkward to sit here and watch his father and mother show off their affection. Hearing this, the young man immediately stood up and said, "I will go ask Yenji where she bought the candied hawthorns." "Wait." The middle-aged man thought for a moment and said, "Since your mother likes to eat it, why don't we directly invite that person to the mansion and arrange for him to be in the kitchen? That way, she can eat it at any time." "I understand." The young man responded and then walked out of the hall. His mother's depression had improved and he was also very happy. From afar, he saw the girl called Yenji walking over and immediately waved at her. Chapter 45. Qing and prefecture was huge. If they wanted to spread the candied haws as quickly as possible, they would need a lot of manpower. Fong alone was far from enough. They parted ways at the city gate. Li Yi followed Fong and listened to him boast about how popular he was with the naughty kids yesterday. When they reached a certain street, Fong's body shook and he looked at the familiar corner of the street. A dozen naughty kids were gathered there, their faces full of anxiety. What candied haws? Are you guys lying to us? Liars are puppies. There really were candied haws yesterday. Why didn't that uncle come today? Are there no candied haws today? The naughty kids paced around anxiously. For the first time in their lives, they didn't sleep in this morning. They woke up all their friends early in the morning and asked their parents for a few copper coins before rushing here. However, they were disappointed to find that the uncle who sold candied haws yesterday was not here. The naughty kids even searched the surrounding area but couldn't find a single candied haw vendor. When they thought about how they would never be able to eat the sweet and sour candied haws again, the naughty kids became even more anxious. Look, that uncle is here. Someone shouted first. The naughty kids turned their heads and saw a familiar figure standing on the street. The next moment, they saw the candied haws that they had been yearning for day and night. Whoosh! The scene from the day before replayed itself. Uncle, I want 2 skewers. I want 3 skewers. Here are 20 copper coins. Give me 4 skewers. The naughty kids fought to be the first. One by one, they stretched out their little hands and stuffed the copper coins into Fong's arms. They were afraid that all the candied haws would be bought by someone else if they were too late. Seeing the naughty kids leave one by one in satisfaction, and the candied haws were half gone, Fong's face was full of smiles. This made him feel like he was one step closer to his dream. However, compared to the feeling of realizing his dream, another feeling came faster and more urgent. Not long after, Fong held his stomach, bent over, and said to Li Yi, son-in-law, please look after him for a while. I'm going to relieve myself. Without waiting for Li Yi to nod, Fong had already disappeared. Li Yi originally wanted to wander around the city, but now he could only wait for Fong to return. After a while, a few sticks of tunghulu were sold. Almost all of the buyers were naughty children, or some adults who were pestered by naughty children. Occasionally, a well-dressed young lady would buy a bunch or two, but when normal adults saw that these were just ordinary red fruits, they didn't have the heart to buy them. This was within Li Yi's expectations. The biggest consumer group of tunghulu were naughty children. Whether it was in ancient times or modern times, women and children were the absolute main consumers, which was in line with his initial positioning of tunghulu. The remaining dozen or so skewers of candied haws were sold out in a short while, leaving only 1 skewer stuck on top. It was an eyesore and uncomfortable no matter how he looked at it. Li Yi frowned and plucked the last skewer of candied haws. Just as he brought it to his mouth, a voice suddenly came from afar. Shut up. Crunch. A crisp sound came. He had already bitten off the first stick of hawthorn fruit. In order to make delicious tunghulu, it was very important to control the heat when boiling the sugar paste. This time, the sugar paste had been boiled for a long time, and it was a little burnt. He remembered to remind them to be careful next time. Then, Li Yi raised his head and looked at the young man who was trotting over. After a moment of surprise, 2 voices came almost at the same time. It's you. It's you. The young man was also a little surprised. He didn't expect that the person selling the tunghulu was actually the scholar who painted the last time. Of course, Li Yi also recognized this friend at once. After all, he had only met one rich man in this world who was willing to spend 10 taels of silver to buy a painting. After a short moment of surprise, the young man moved his eyes away from Li Yi's face and looked at the last stick of tunghulu in his hand, which he had already bitten off. You, he stretched out a finger and pointed at Li Yi. Just as he said one word, he suddenly waved his hand dispiritedly, grabbed Li Yi's arm, and said, "Follow me." What are you doing? The young man was thin and weak, but he was quite strong. Li Yi staggered and was forcibly pulled forward by him. Did you make this tunghulu? Let go of me first. Is it you or not? So what if it is? That's right. Life was like being kid. Since he couldn't resist, he would enjoy it. After a while, Lee understood that his strength was far less than the young man's. If he continued to struggle like this, he would be the one suffering. So, he simply gave up resisting and followed the young man forward. It didn't look like this guy wanted to drag him to see the officials because someone died from eating tanghulu, as long as it wasn't about that. At this time, on the street not far in front of the two of them, several strong men swaggered. The leader was a man with a scar on his face. He took 2 steamed buns from a stall on the street. The stall owner saw that the man swaggered away without paying, and a trace of anger flashed in his eyes. Finally, he sighed and could only accept his bad luck. He dared to be angry but didn't dare to say anything. "Big brother, look who that is." Suddenly, one of the men beside the scarred man trembled and suddenly pointed to the front as if he had seen something. When the scarred man heard this, he looked up and saw a familiar figure. He was slightly startled, and his face immediately became gloomy. How could he forget that he was beaten up by a few hateful guys in the alley that day? He was beaten miserably. The saddest thing was that he was arrested and sent to jail for several days. Not only did he eat moldy food, he didn't even have a comfortable place to sleep. Every time he dreamed of those days, he would wake up in a cold sweat. The source of all this was because of the guy who made him gnash his teeth in hatred when he thought about it. And the scholar who he would only be satisfied with if he could destroy the people had now appeared in front of him again. Follow them. Even if these ruffians were bold, they still didn't dare to do anything too presumptuous on the street. With a gloomy face, they ordered and followed far behind the 2 people. Until now, Lee still didn't know where the young man was hurriedly dragging him and what they were going to do. Just as he was about to ask again, there was suddenly a burst of chaotic footsteps behind them. In an instant, the 2 of them were surrounded. "Who are you people? What do you want?" the young man asked with a frown when his path was blocked. "Brat, if you know what's good for you, hurry up and scram. This has nothing to do with you." The scarred man glared at the young man, and then looked at Lee with extreme hatred in his eyes. Chapter 46. When he saw the scar-faced man again, Lee knew that things were going to be bad. Just by looking at the hateful expression on his face and his fiery eyes, it was obvious that this guy was a very vengeful person. Last time, he had Fong and the others by his side to protect him. This time, it was just the 2 of them. Moreover, the young man beside him did not seem to have much combat power. It was likely that he would be defeated this time. The 2 of them had already passed through the most bustling street. At this time, there were only a few passers-by on both sides of the road. These people had clearly planned to surround them here. Scram! Although the young man did not recognize the scar-faced man in front of him, it was obvious that the other party was up to no good. His face darkened as he spoke coldly. It was obvious that the enemy was strong while he was weak, but this young man was still so unyielding. This caused Lee to involuntarily look at him a few more times. He was not afraid in the face of danger and did not bow down to evil forces. He had some of the demeanor that Lee had in the past. "What did you say?" The scar-faced man's expression froze. He looked at Lee and the young man in front of him with a gloomy expression. "Can't you see that I have so many people on my side? You actually dare to speak to me like this?" Thinking of the scholar's reaction last time, the scar-faced man looked at the 2 of them again. Could they be blood brothers? "Brat, I originally wanted to let you go today. Now, don't even think about leaving." The scar-faced man stared at the young man with an unfriendly gaze and said fiercely. Without those abnormal fellows from last time, the scar-faced man did not feel any pressure in his heart. "I'll give you 3 breaths of time to finish them off." At this time, the young man opened his mouth with a gloomy expression. It was as if he was speaking to the surrounding air. The scar-faced man and the other men were stunned when they heard this. It was obvious that they were surprised by the young man's actions. However, in the next moment, they could not help but burst into laughter. "Brat, could it be that you've lost your mind? one of the men had just spoken halfway when a passerby who walked past him suddenly exploded and punched out. The man's body was immediately sent flying. There was no time for the scar-faced man and the others to react. A man who was squatting down at a roadside stall and picking up goods used one hand to support himself. With a sweep of his leg, another few men fell. Clang! It was the sound of a long sword being unsheathed. Suddenly, a flash of saber light flashed in front of the scar-faced man's eyes. A peddler who was carrying a load and walking by suddenly turned around, pulled out a long saber from his waist and put it on the scar-faced man's neck. Everything happened so suddenly. Not only did the scar-faced man and the others not expect it, but even Li Yi was stunned. What the hell was going on? Let's go. At this moment, the young man grabbed Li Yi's arm again and walked straight past them, as if nothing had happened. The scarred man stood there in a daze, cold sweat dripping down from his forehead. Steamed bun was once again held at knife point. At this moment, he felt as if his entire outlook on life was collapsing. That person looked at him without any emotion, as if he was looking at a dead person. Just from the look in his eyes, the scar-faced man knew that he really dared to kill him. Until now, he still didn't understand why these passers-by were so skilled, and why they would listen to that young man. In the distance, there was suddenly a flurry of footsteps. A few bailiffs dressed in black jogged over. The moment he saw those bailiffs, the scar-faced man was so moved that tears almost flowed out. Although he didn't know how many times he had been taught a lesson by these bailiffs, at this moment, seeing their figures, the scar-faced man felt as if he had seen his family. Family! Come and save us! What are you doing? Put down your sabers. In Anqing Prefectural City, there were actually people who dared to use sabers to hurt people on the streets. The leading bailiffs roared, pulled out the saber at his waist, and pointed it at the people in the distance. The expression of the man holding the saber didn't change. He felt around his waist, and casually threw a token over. The bailiffs reached out and caught it. After glancing at it, his expression changed, and he hurriedly put away his saber. He jogged over and said, "My lord, take all of these people back and await punishment." The man withdrew his saber from the scar-faced man's neck, waved his hand at the bailiffs, picked up his load, and quickly disappeared into the streets. When the bailiffs looked back, he discovered that the two people who had been standing next to him had also disappeared. After standing in place for a moment, his expression darkened. He pointed at the ruffians, and loudly said to the bailiffs, "Take them all back." With great difficulty, he found the restroom to relieve himself. Fong came out of the restroom with a satisfied expression. As he walked back along the street, he kept wondering if his wife had added something to his breakfast. Otherwise, how could he have gone to the restroom 4 times in a row, and now walk so lightly? Son-in-law. Walking to the familiar corner of the street, Fong had just opened his mouth to call out when he saw that the original position was empty. He suddenly froze, and asked, "Son-in-law?" Just as the man surnamed Fong was looking for Li Yi all over the world, Li Yi was staring at a tall gate in a daze. The scene that had just happened on the street had already caused him to have some doubts about this young man's background. At this moment, he deeply realized that this nouveau riche's background was not ordinary. Ningguang Mansion. Above the gate, there was a large plaque with these words written squarely on it. Of course, such a plaque could not be hung on the door of one's own house. Could it be that this young man in front of him was actually a member of the royal family of the Jing Kingdom? Before Li Yi could figure out this question, he was pulled into the gate by the young man. "Young prince." The 2 servants standing at the door hurriedly bowed to greet him. This prince's mansion was very big. Being pulled by the young man, Li Yi didn't know how many twists and turns they had gone through, and finally stopped in front of a gatehouse. The young man pushed the door open, and when the few people in the room looked up, they immediately stopped what they were doing, and bowed together, saying, "Young prince. Quick, make some candied fruits immediately." The young man waved his hand at them and said in a hurried tone. Hearing this, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. After all this time, this guy had hurriedly brought him here just to make candied fruits for him? This was the first time that Li Yi had seen such a willful nouveau riche. Looking around, looking at the furnishings here, it should be a kitchen or something like that. On the table beside him, there were some hawthorns and white sugar. It seemed that they had tried making candied fruits by themselves. However, although the method of making candied fruits was simple, the ratio of sugar to water, the temperature, and the time of boiling would affect the taste of the candied fruits. Without countless predecessors, hundreds and thousands of years of exploration and experimentation, it was really not an easy thing to make delicious candied fruits. Chapter 47. While Li Yi was looking around, the people around him were also looking at him. The person who made candied haws and improved the princess's depression was the scholar in front of them. It had to be said that this was quite different from the image they had imagined. It's not difficult to make candied haws. You just need to add water to the icing and boil it into a sugar paste, and then wrap it on the red fruits without seeds. Li Yi looked at the young man and said, "I've told you the method of making candied haws. I'm sorry, I still have something urgent to deal with. Goodbye." Li Yi didn't want to tell anyone about the core technique of candied haws. He was not familiar with this guy, and he just wanted to keep his own territory. He didn't want to have anything to do with the prince's mansion. If he didn't go back, Fong would be worried if he couldn't find him. After that, Li Yi strode outside. "Child, please wait." At this moment, a sweet voice came from behind. The girl named Yanji quickly walked up and said, "Child, you don't know. Although there are only two materials, red fruits and icing, we have tried many times, but the taste of the candied haws is still not satisfactory. Please tell me if there is any mystery in it." Li Yi paused and then said with a smile, "Miss, I'm afraid you think too much. I've told you everything I know. There is no mystery in it." Li Yi's face was full of sincerity. Although the girl still had doubts in her heart, she was already 70 to 80% convinced. She turned to the young man and said, "Young prince, the person who sold the candied haws yesterday was not this young master. I'm afraid we have the wrong person." "Yes, yes." Li Yi nodded and quickened his pace toward the door. 10 taels of silver. At this moment, the young man suddenly said. The girl was stunned when she heard this. She didn't know what the little prince meant. At the same time, Li Yi had just stepped out of the door when he suddenly stopped. "I was rude just now. If I offended you in any way, please don't blame me. Yanji, give this brother 10 taels of silver as an apology." Li Yi turned his head and found that the young man was looking at him with a faint smile. After looking at the young man for a few seconds, Li Yi also smiled. Only the two of them knew what this smile meant. This little prince was also a person who was particular. The smile on Li Yi's face became even brighter. He said with a smile, "Although there is nothing special about the cooking method of this dish, it is rare for the young prince to be so kind. What's the harm in trying it out?" Although she didn't know why this child suddenly changed his mind, he had promised to help her. The girl was happy and said hurriedly, "Thank you very much." The strange expression on the young man's face became even more obvious. He stretched out his hand and made an inviting gesture. "Brother, please." After a while, everyone, including the young man, looked at Li Yi skillfully handling the hawthorn and boiling the sugar paste. His movements were smooth, and their faces revealed an astonished expression. For a gentle and refined scholar to do such things, it still gave them quite a shock. Because there were no bamboo sticks, Li Yi wrapped the candied hawthorn in the sugar paste and placed it on a plate. The girl used her chopsticks to pick one up. After taking a bite, her beautiful eyes couldn't help but light up. She turned to the young man and said, "Little prince, this is the taste from yesterday. I'll send it to mother right away." The young man was overjoyed. He took the plate from the girl's hands and strode out. Li Yi felt a little strange when he heard this. From the looks of it, the one who liked eating candied hawthorn seemed to be some princess. Could it be that eating candied hawthorn could make one addicted? After the young man left, the girl bowed to Li Yi and said, "Thank you, young master. Thanks to young master's candied hawthorn, the princess's illness has improved." The princess's illness? Li Yi was a little confused when he heard this. He really didn't know that candied hawthorn could actually have the effect of treating illnesses. May I ask, what illness is the princess suffering from? Li Yi was a little curious and couldn't help but ask. The girl's expression was a little hesitant, but then she thought about it. If it wasn't for the scholar in front of her, the princess's illness wouldn't have improved. After thinking for a while, she said, the imperial physician said it's an illness of stagnation. However, after taking the medicine for half a month, the princess is still tired of eating every day and can't sleep at night. During this period of time, her body has become increasingly thin. Li Yi didn't know what an illness of stagnation was, but he understood from the girl's description. Can't eat, can't sleep, is prone to fever, and is getting more and more haggard. Isn't this indigestion? Needless to say, Li Yi also knew that in this prince's mansion, there must be a lot of fish and meat all day long. If one's stomach wasn't good, it would be strange if he didn't have indigestion. And candied hawthorn had the effect of clearing the lungs, digesting food, and stimulating the appetite. It was especially effective for indigestion caused by eating too much meat. In his previous life, Li Yi's stomach was very bad. Every time he came home, one of the dishes on the table was candied hawthorn. When he was studying abroad, his mother would often call to remind him to take care of his stomach, eat less greasy food, eat more coarse grains, pay attention to nourishing his stomach, and don't stay up late at night. And that person who loved him the most and treated him the best in the world, he would never see her again. Suddenly touching the deepest memories in his heart, Li Yi's eyes unconsciously became wet. The girl named Yanji looked at the scholar with tears in his eyes in surprise. She just talked about the princess's illness, and this child was moved to tears? At this moment, the door of the kitchen was suddenly pushed open, and the young prince walked in with an excited face. He ordered a few cooks, immediately make some of the princess's favorite dishes. I didn't expect this candied hawthorn to have such a miraculous effect. The young man turned to look at Li Yi and said with a face full of surprise. The illness of stagnation that even the imperial physicians couldn't do anything about could actually improve because of this small thing. His mother, who was usually extremely anorexic, actually took the initiative to eat after eating those red fruits. It was really hard to imagine. At this moment, Li Yi's mood had already returned to normal. He smiled and said, the red fruits are indeed effective in treating stagnation, but it isn't a cure for the root cause. Do you know how to treat stagnation? The young man's body suddenly trembled when he heard this, and he grabbed Li Yi's arm and asked. I know a thing or two. Li Yi said with a smile. Li Yi felt a little apologetic in his heart for charging him 10 taels of silver for a candied hawthorn dish. No matter what, they were old customers. Li Yi had to make them feel that these 10 taels of silver were well spent. If these words were said by someone else, the young man and the girl would definitely not believe them. But when Li Yi said it, they already believed most of it. After all, he had already created a miracle. Just as the expressions on the two's faces became wild with joy, on the other side of Qing and prefectural city, looking at the gradually darkening sky, Master Fang's face was full of anxiety and worry. Chapter 48. Fang searched the entire Qing and prefecture but did not find any trace of Li Yi. Fang Lao San, you fool. Isn't the son-in-law with you? You've lost him. Another man beside Fang looked equally anxious. I don't know. I just went to the bathroom and when I came back, the son-in-law was gone. Fang said helplessly. Even he couldn't understand. How could such a grown man like the son-in-law go missing just like that? If the son-in-law really can't be found, I'll see how you're going to explain it to Miss. The man beside him glared at him and said. Do you think the son-in-law ran away? At this moment, a hint of hesitation appeared on the other man's face and he spoke hesitantly. Nonsense. Hearing this, the man surnamed Fang was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He turned his head abruptly and looked at him with an unfriendly gaze. He reprimanded, the son-in-law is not that kind of person. Fang. The man who reprimanded the man surnamed Fang spoke in a low voice and said slowly, What old Wu said is not impossible. After all, the son-in-law, he did not finish his sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. After all, the son-in-law was snatched. Although during this period of time, almost everyone had deliberately ignored this fact, it was still an undeniable fact. Because of the appearance of Li Yi, their lives had long been turned upside down. No one was willing to mention that matter. From the bottom of their hearts, they had already regarded Li Yi as one of their own. However, no matter how unwilling they were to admit it, at this moment, everyone could not help but think of a certain worst possibility. Everyone, let's split up and search again. Where could the son-in-law be waiting for us? After a moment, a resolute expression appeared on the face of the man surnamed Fang. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice. The rest of them looked at each other and could only sigh. They dispersed and began another round of searching. Li Yi was not a medical student. If the princess had any other illness, he, who had not digested a medical book, naturally had no right to speak. But when it came to treating gastrointestinal problems and indigestion, he could be considered half an expert. In his previous life, in order to adjust his stomach, his mother had used all kinds of methods. At that time, Li Yi did not care much about it. Now that he thought about it, each and every one of them was clearly imprinted in his mind, as if they were carved into his memory. Li Yi did not give them a long lecture on modern medical theories and directly said, other than using red fruits and sugar to stir-fry candied haws, you can crush corn and yam together and boil it into porridge. It will also have a miraculous effect on treating Wang Fei's illness. Stir-fried hawthorn with sugar and yam porridge were common dishes on Li Yi's dining table. There was no digestive aid in this world. Hawthorn could only be used as an appetizer. When the appetite was good, the body would naturally be better. The pretty servant girl and the young prince listened attentively. Li Yi continued, every day after dinner, Wang Fei can take a walk in the garden for an hour. It will also help to alleviate the illness. In addition, there is one more thing to remember. For this period of time, Wang Fei's diet should be light. You must not eat meat or fish all day. Try to avoid greasy food, such as, at this point in Li Yi's speech, the young man hurriedly ordered the few cooks, did you all hear that? Remove all the greasy dishes I mentioned. That's about all I know. After speaking for so long, Li Yi could not help but feel a little thirsty. His eyes inadvertently glanced out of the window and found that the sky had completely darkened. Yanji, do you remember everything I said? The young man turned to the young girl and asked. Hearing this, Yanji nodded, young prince, I have remembered everything. Even the imperial physicians were helpless. This handsome scholar in front of them was their only hope. If Li Yi was giving them a prescription, they would definitely carefully consider it. But he did not mention anything from the beginning to the end. Most of it was a change in the diet. Although they did not understand the reason, it seemed that he did not speak without thinking, it is getting late. I have told you everything I know. I will not disturb you anymore. With the 10 taels of silver already in his pocket, Li Yi very timely said his goodbyes. If he was any later, Fang and the others would be anxious to death. The young man did not know whether Li Yi's method was effective or not. But the appearance of the candied hawthorn had indeed improved his mother's condition. For this, he had to owe Li Yi a favor. Putting an arm around Li Yi's shoulder, he said, Brother, you have helped me so much. If I do not thank you properly, I will feel very sorry. How about this, we will hold a banquet in the Jade Courtyard tonight. We will not stop until we are drunk. During this period of time, his mother's illness had almost become a sore point in his heart. Now that he had seen endless hope, he was extremely carefree. There is no need for a banquet. I have urgent matters to attend to at home. Hey, brother, this is not right. Are you looking down on me? I do not mean that, then follow me. The young girl named Yanji watched the young prince and the scholar leave with their arms around each other's shoulders. Her pretty face could not help but show a trace of a smile. This young prince of her family was good at everything except for the fact that he did not have any arrogance. He looked like a playboy. If he were to inherit the throne in the future, the young girl really could not imagine what kind of situation it would be. This thought only appeared in her mind for a moment, and she hurriedly left the kitchen. Although she remembered everything that the scholar had said just now, it was hard to guarantee that she would not forget it in the future. It was better to find a piece of paper and write it down quickly. Li Yi was hurriedly dragged out of the prince's mansion by the young prince, who did not look like a young prince at all. Outside the Willow Leaf village, the big man surnamed Fong walked into the village in a daze with a blank face. The few men behind him also looked worried. On the other side of the village, the young servant girl was busy in the kitchen. She was humming a little song that the son-in-law taught her. It was unknown what she was thinking, but the corners of her mouth slightly curled up and her two black eyebrows curved into a beautiful arc. It is almost the Mid-Autumn festival. When the son-in-law comes back, it is time to make some mooncakes, the young servant girl murmured. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door in the courtyard. The son-in-law is back. The young girl's face lit up with joy. She ran out of the kitchen with light steps, crossed the courtyard, and opened the door. When she saw the familiar face of Fong, the smile on her pretty face became even wider. "Uncle Fong, you are back." After looking around, she found that other than the big man surnamed Fong and the others, there was no sign of Li Yi. A trace of doubt appeared on the young girl's pretty face, and she asked, "Where is the son-in-law?" Fong raised his head and looked at Xiao Huan with a complicated expression. After a long time, he opened his mouth with some difficulty. The son-in-law is missing." "What?" The young girl's delicate body shook when she heard this. After she recovered, her pretty face immediately became pale. Chapter 49. "Miss, it's all my fault. I should have stayed by the son-in-law's side." Master Fong lowered his head and spoke in a low voice. His face was filled with remorse. Lu Rui's expression did not change. After a moment of silence, she nodded and said, "I understand." Unable to read the emotions in her heart, Master Fong and the others opened their mouths but did not say anything in the end. When they left with a sigh, Lu Rui leaned against the door with her sword in her arms. She looked at the almost full moon in the sky and her pretty face was as cold as ever. The young servant girl stood in the courtyard with red and swollen eyes and stared in the direction of the courtyard door. After a long time, she sniffed hard and murmured, "The son-in-law will definitely come back." After an unknown period of time, Lu Rui walked into the room and looked at the woman in the room. She said, "Sister, do you need me to go down the mountain?" Lu Rui knew what she wanted to say and did not wait for her to finish. She waved her hand and said, "There's no need." As she spoke, she looked a little absent-minded. Even though the two of them were not husband and wife, they were husband and wife after all. At this moment, she could not help but feel a little disappointed. Her initial plan was to let Li Yi go after a few days. But as time passed, her thoughts changed. No matter what, she would have to get married in this lifetime. In the past, she had always been busy for the sake of living and had never thought about these things. But these days, that slightly thin figure, in a relaxed manner, had inadvertently carried this family on her shoulders. She no longer had to worry about those things that she needed to worry about in the past. Occasionally, she would think that if he was unwilling to leave and they could continue like this for the rest of their lives, it would not be unacceptable even if the act between the two of them became real. But in the end, this was no longer possible. The Jadeite Courtyard. The name of this courtyard sounded indecent. Just from the name, one could tell that this was probably the same as Yihong Courtyard, and Kuai Hua Lu Li Yi suspected that tonight was not just a simple meal. This young prince's way of doing things was completely different from what Li Yi had imagined. He always went out alone without a few lackeys. It was a great waste of resources. But thinking of the scene on the street in the afternoon, Li Yi immediately understood. On the surface, he was alone. Who knew how many people were secretly protecting him? An ordinary passerby or an inconspicuous peddler on the street could turn into the ultimate bodyguard in an instant. "Remember, after we go in, don't call me young prince. Just call me brotherly." When they walked to the Jadeite Courtyard, the young prince named Li Xian suddenly put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder and said in a low voice. Li Yi nodded. He was not surprised at all. People who wandered around in Jianghu used an alternate name to save their lives. When they visited a brothel, they still used the title of Little Prince. If this was spread out, their prince's father would probably break their legs. By the way, I still don't know this brother's name, Li Xian suddenly asked after taking 2 steps. Li Yi. Li Yi looked around curiously and whispered. After living for 2 lifetimes, this was the first time he had visited a brothel. He was a little excited. Brother, your surname is also Li. What a coincidence. Li Xian said in surprise. Although this guy was quite handsome, Li Yi still didn't want to have any fate with him. As soon as the 2 of them stepped into the jade courtyard, a woman in her 30s with heavy makeup immediately greeted them. She squeezed out a smile and said, "Hey, isn't this Li? You haven't been here for a long time." Li Yi was stunned for a moment before he realized that the madam wasn't talking about him. Then, he looked at Li Xian with a surprised expression. So this guy was actually a regular here. At this time, Li Yi couldn't help but have some doubts in his heart. Was this guy really a young lord? Don't say anything unnecessary. Where is Miss Zoyamo? Hurry up and call her out. Li Xian waved his hand and threw her a silver ingot. He said impatiently. Li Yi turned to look at him. Didn't he say that he would treat her to a meal? How did it become a brothel to sleep with girls? His chastity of 2 lifetimes couldn't be casually given away here. If this guy made any unhealthy suggestions later, he must refuse without hesitation. The madam caught the silver and was slightly happy. But then she said with a troubled expression, Li, you know that Zoe Mo is our top artist here. It's up to her whether she sees guests or not. I can't force her. Li Xian frowned when he heard this. He hated people who didn't do anything after receiving the silver. Seeing this, the madam hurriedly changed the topic and said, however, Zoe Mo's program is about to start. Why don't I ask her after her program is over? Li Xian waved his hand and said, forget it. I just want her to sing a song to liven things up. Since she is going on stage in a while, it will save me the trouble. The madam muttered in her heart. Every time this Li came to the jade courtyard, he didn't look for a girl. He just wanted to listen to Zoe Mo sing. It was really strange. However, she didn't dare to say this out loud. After all, this was her financial backer. A thick smile immediately appeared on her face, and she called out, gentlemen, please follow me to the private room. Drunken Mo will be here soon. The private room that the madam mentioned was a relatively spacious room. The floor was covered with a clean carpet, and there was a space in the middle separated by a curtain. After the madam led Li Yi and Zoe Mo to sit down, she excused herself and went to work. In front of the 2 of them was a long, short table. There were many fruits and all sorts of dishes on it. Li Xian sat cross-legged on the table. He casually picked up a grape from the table and popped it into his mouth. He glanced at Li Yi and said somewhat smugly, what? You've never been to a place like this before, right? Li Yi nodded when he heard this. It was indeed the first time he had been to such a place. Firstly, he had no money. He couldn't afford such a place at all. Secondly, he didn't have the opportunity. He couldn't imagine what would happen if Xiao Huan and Sister Rui knew that he visited a brothel. After all, he was a man with a family. Following Li Xian's example, Li Yi sat down cross-legged and looked around. There were quite a few silhouettes at the tables around the room. At that moment, they were all quietly chatting with the people beside them. As Li Yi's gaze swept past the door, he suddenly saw a few silhouettes walk in. He could only see that those people were all women, walking slowly into the gauze tent. Miss Zoe Mo is here. There was a small noise around. Not long after, when music came from the gauze tent, the slightly noisy crowd all shut their mouths. Li Yi also looked with interest at the few graceful figures who had begun to dance in the gauze tent. After a moment, a pleasant voice floated out from the gauze tent. Delicate clouds play tricks, flying stars spread hatred, the silver river crosses in the dark, the golden wind and jade do meet, surpassing countless things in the world. When he heard this, Li Yi's body shook violently, and an expression of extreme shock appeared on his face. Chapter 50. Li Yi was very sure that although poetry also existed in this world, it was only in the same form. Great writers such as Li Bai, Du Fu, Su Shi, and Lu Yong did not exist in the original world. Of course, their works would not appear in this world either. Translator, Lon_editor, Ephidacia Li Yi was shocked when he heard the poem, which shouldn't have existed in this world. Then, his shock turned into ecstasy. Could it be that the other party had also transmigrated to this world like him? No one could understand Li Yi's feelings. He was a lonely soul drifting alone in this world. Even if there was a person, no, even if it was a dog from the same world as him, it would still bring the greatest comfort to his soul. Li Xian, who was enjoying the song and dance, did not notice that Li Yi had become very excited. He abruptly stood up and strode to the center of the stage, pulling aside the veil. The woman who was singing with her face covered by a veil seemed to be frightened. Her voice came to an abrupt stop. She looked at the young scholar who had suddenly rushed over with an excited expression. A trace of panic appeared on her face under the veil. Did you also transmigrate from the earth? Li Yi grabbed the woman's hand and asked anxiously. At this moment, everyone in the surroundings had recovered from their shock. When everyone saw what was happening, they immediately stood up, and expressions of shock and anger appeared on their faces. Stop. Let go of Miss Zumo. Who dares to make trouble in this jade courtyard? The young prince, Li Xian, was also stunned, not knowing what was going on. This guy is so impatient. Let go of me, you lecher. When the woman's hand was grabbed by Li Yi, she was really frightened. She stood there in a daze and didn't move at all. However, when she came back to her senses, she suddenly shook off his hand. A look of shame and anger appeared on her face. She took a few steps back and looked at him as she scolded. Li Yi stood there in a daze. Things seemed to be different from what he had imagined. Looking at the girl's reaction, could it be that he had guessed wrong? Right at this moment, the madam ran in with a few strong men, and she cursed furiously. Who the hell is so ignorant to actually dare to cause trouble in the Jade Field courtyard? Quickly arrest him. Those men saw Li Yi standing in the middle of the stage at a glance. They strode over and pressed down on his shoulders. Li Yi allowed the two men to pin his hands behind his back as he glared at the woman. Where did you learn that Immortal Magpie Bridge song? The woman didn't want to pay attention to him, but when she saw the crazed look in his eyes, her heart couldn't help but tremble. For some reason, she opened her mouth and explained, this poem has been known to everyone since a month ago. It is said that it was written on the sky prayer lantern by a gifted scholar named Li Yi. A month ago, the sky prayer lantern, Li Yi. Li Yi muttered a few words, and a look of deep disappointment appeared on his face. It should be Xiao Huan's sky prayer lamp. Hurry up and throw him out. The madam roared when she saw that the men were still standing in the same spot. Stop. Right at this moment, a voice rang out in front of them, and Li Xian slowly walked over with an ugly expression on his face. He walked to the front of the men and said coldly, "Let him go." Who do you think you are? One of the men sneered. Halfway through his sentence, Li Xian's expression turned cold. The man only felt his vision blur, and his entire body was sent flying with a kick. At this moment, Li Xian seemed to have changed into a different person. No matter how he usually behaved, his identity as a young prince would never change. How could he let a prostitute from a brothel insult him like this? You're courting death. The other men's expressions turned ugly when they saw this. Just as they were about to make a move, the madam immediately jogged over. All of you, stop. Li, what's going on? She looked at Li Xian with a fawning expression and asked. Li Xian indifferently glanced at Li Yi, who was being held down by the two men. The madam immediately understood. She glared at the two men and said, "Hurry up and release him." Although the madam did not know Li Xian's identity, people like her knew best who they could offend and who they could not. The young man in front of her obviously belonged to the latter. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. The sourness in Li Yi's heart at this moment could not be described with words. He did not even have the mood to visit the brothel anymore, and walked out without saying a word. Li Xian looked back at the woman, and a trace of doubt appeared on his face. Then, he turned his head and chased after her. "Hey, brother Li, wait for me." The place where her arm had been grabbed just now was still a little painful. The woman named Drunken Amo looked at the direction in which her face had left and murmured, "That scholar." While she was thinking about something, the madam had already walked over quickly and asked with concern, "Zoe Amo, are you okay?" The woman shook her head when she heard this. The madam's heart immediately calmed down. Any accident to the top artist of the Jade Courtyard would be a great loss to them. Whether it was in his previous life or this life, Li Yi had never touched a drop of alcohol, but at this moment, he just wanted to get drunk. A toast to the past, and never look back. The dead were dead, and people always had to look forward. The faces of Xiao Huan, Lu Rui, and even Fong appeared in his mind. Li Yi took a deep breath and strode to a wine shop on the street. "Shopkeeper, bring me the strongest wine you have here." A fat shopkeeper came over and looked at Li Yi with a smile. "Young master, our strongest wine here is too strong. Ordinary people, cut the crap. Are you afraid that I can't afford it?" Pa. A silver ingot had been slapped on the table by Li Yi. "Okay, wait a moment, young master, the wine will be here soon." When the shopkeeper saw the silver ingot, his eyes lit up and he hurried to the counter to get the wine. Li Xian walked in from outside and sat opposite to Li Yi. He looked at him and sighed, "No matter how beautiful that Miss Zoe Mo is, she is just a prostitute." "Brother Li is a capable man, why do you insist on being a prostitute?" Although they had only had 2 short interactions, it was obvious that this little prince had already developed a lot of interest in Li Yi. If it weren't for this, with his identity, no matter how much he lowered his status, how could he call an ordinary person brother? "Sir, your wine is here." Li Xian obviously misunderstood, but Li Yi didn't want to explain. When the shopkeeper put the wine on the table, he picked up the jar and took a big gulp. Plop. Before falling on the table, Li Yi finally understood why he didn't drink before. Seeing this, Li Xian was stunned for a moment, and then laughed out loud. "I didn't expect your alcohol tolerance to be so poor." He grabbed the jar of wine that Li Yi had just drunk from with one hand and gulped it down a few mouthfuls. Plop. The two of them leaned on the table in the same posture. When the shopkeeper saw this scene at the counter, he couldn't help but curl his lips. "You have such a poor alcohol tolerance, but you still dare to ask for the strongest wine. You deserve it." At the corner of a street not far from the wine shop, a few figures dressed in coarse clothes walked out from the darkness when they saw the 2 people lying drunk on the table in the wine shop. The corners of their mouths pulled into a bitter smile as they walked out. Chapter 51. When he regained consciousness a little, he felt that his whole head was swollen. He tried hard for a long time, but he couldn't open his eyes. He could only hear a few intermittent voices around him. Wang Fei actually ate something in the morning. She also specially drank a small bowl of yam and corn porridge. Wang Ye was very happy. He increased everyone's allowance in the kitchen. When he finally opened his eyes, he felt that his mouth was unusually bitter and thirsty. At this time, a clear voice sounded not far away. "Young master is awake." A hot towel was handed over. Li Yi carelessly wiped his face. He looked at the 2 maids standing in the room and said in a hoarse voice, "Water." A moment later, he took the teacup from the maid's hand and drank it in one gulp. He still didn't feel thirsty. After drinking a few cups, the feeling of thirst subsided a lot. At this time, a maid came over with a tray covered with a red cloth. She said with a smile, "Young master, this is a thank you gift that Wang Ye asked me to prepare for you. Please accept it." "Thank you gift? What is it?" Li Yi had just woken up and his mind was not very clear. He casually removed the red cloth and was almost dazzled by the neat silver ingots on the tray. "Thank Wang Ye for me." Li Yi took the tray from the maid's hand with a face full of smiles. The trace of drowsiness was immediately swept away and he looked much more energetic. The maid was stunned when she heard this. It seemed that she didn't think that Li Yi would agree so readily. Just now, Wang Ye specifically told her that if the other party insisted on not accepting it, she must persuade him to accept it. For this, she had made a little preparation in her heart. But the real situation made her a little dazed. Didn't they say that scholars regarded money as dirt? This young master didn't seem to be like this. Li Yi carried a small bag on his back and walked out of Ning Wang Fu. He waved to the woman called Yanji behind him and strode away. Last night, he drank a mouthful of wine and was drunk on the table. It was so shameful. He did not wait for the young prince to wake up and could not wait to leave the prince's mansion. There was a total of 110 taels of silver in the small bag he was carrying on his back. Although it was only about 50,000 renminbi, this was indeed the first large sum of money that Li Yi had received since he came to this era. The son of a nouveau riche must have a nouveau riche father. Li Yi liked this kind of forthright prince. It was too troublesome to talk about feelings. It was better to directly talk about money. His wallet was bulging, and even his heart was filled. He just didn't know how anxious Fang and the others would be when they didn't see him yesterday. It was better to return to the stronghold as soon as possible. In the willow leaf stockade, the little servant girl sat in front of the door. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her beautiful big eyes had lost their spirit. She had 2 dark circles under her eyes and stared straight ahead. Not long after, a sturdy figure walked over from afar. The man surnamed Fang held a cloth bag in his hand. He walked in front of the servant girl, sighed, and said, "Xiao Huan, this is the money from yesterday's candied haws. Take it back and keep it well." The young girl did not speak. She bit her lips and shook her head. The idea was given by the son-in-law, and the frosting was also bought by the son-in-law. We only put in a little effort. This money is not safe in our hands. You better keep it. Fang put the cloth bag at the feet of the young girl. In the end, he did not say anything and turned to leave slowly. The young girl quietly sat in the familiar position. It seemed that there was still a figure beside her. Just like before, he told her those nice stories and taught her how to cook delicious food. That was almost the best time of her life. Thinking that the figure would never appear again, the young girl's nose could not help but feel a little sour. She forced herself not to let the tears fall. After all, she was only a 15 or 16-year-old girl. After an unknown amount of time, the tears in her eyes could no longer be controlled. She buried her little head between her legs and sobbed. "Xiao Huan, why are you crying? Who made you angry?" A voice suddenly came from the front. The young girl's body could not help but tremble. She suddenly raised her head and saw a familiar face that could not be more familiar. A glimmer of light suddenly appeared in the young girl's eyes, but it quickly dimmed. From yesterday until now, this scene had appeared countless times. From the surprise at the beginning to the numbness at the end, she knew that no matter how real an illusion was, it was still an illusion. Looking at the young servant girl's tearful face, Li Yi's heart could not help but ache. He quickly walked over and wiped the tears off her face. He softly said, "Tell me, who bullied you? The son-in-law will help you vent your anger." The young girl stared blankly at Li Yi, helping her wipe away her tears. The real touch on her face made her realize that this was not an illusion. Son-in-law. In her beautiful big eyes, tears flowed out. In an instant, Li Yi felt that there was an additional delicate body in his arms. The usually shy servant girl would never do something like this. At this moment, she was like a pear blossom in tears. She seemed to be using all her strength to hold on to his body, causing Li Yi to be a little confused. At this moment, the courtyard door opened from the inside. Li Yi saw Lu Rui's figure appear. He pointed at the crying young servant girl and asked, "What's wrong with Xiao Huan?" Lu Rui stood at the door with his sword in his arms. He just looked at Li Yi. Although there was nothing strange on the surface, he seemed to have suddenly relaxed. The appearance of Lu Rui made Xiao Huan stop sobbing. She lowered her head and stood beside Li Yi with a blushing face. She tightly held onto the corner of his clothes, unwilling to let go. Son-in-law. Fang's loud voice came from behind. Anyone could hear the boundless surprise in his voice. Son-in-law, you're back. Seeing that Fang, who was so excited that he looked like he had married a few concubines, was about to give him a big bear hug, Li Yi immediately retreated far away with vigilance. He had just enjoyed Xiao Huan's soft embrace. He was unwilling to let Fang touch him no matter what. Fang was not angry that he did not get a bear hug. He looked at Li Yi and asked with a puzzled face, Son-in-law, where did you go last night? Last night. Li Yi said halfway before he realized that if he said that he went to the brothel to listen to music last night, it would be a little inappropriate. He changed the topic and said, last night. Last night, I got lost in the city. I couldn't find you, so I stayed in the inn for the night and came back at dawn. From last night until today, Fang had always thought that if it were not for him, he would not have lost his son-in-law. He was deeply immersed in the torment in his heart and did not sleep for the whole night. It was only when he saw Li Yi today that all his self-blame and regret were swept away. He felt that his life was suddenly filled with light again. Li Yi took down the bundle on his shoulder and handed it to Xiao Huan. He instructed, take this back and put it in my cabinet. Xiao Huan stretched out her hand to take it, but she did not expect the small bundle to be much heavier than she had imagined. The bundle accidentally fell from her hand and fell to the ground. Whoosh! The bundle opened up, and a pile of silver ingots rolled out. Under the sunlight, they almost dazzled Fang's eyes. Xiao Huan covered her mouth in shock. Her pretty face was filled with disbelief. Lu Rui could not help but tighten his grip on his sword. His expression changed. Not far away, Madame Wu walked out of the house. She had just poured out a basin of dirty water when she suddenly felt that the ground not far away from her was a little dazzling. She could not help but turn her head to look. Clang! The copper basin in her hand fell to the ground with a clear sound. Chapter 52. As a commoner who was afraid of poverty and starvation, Fang couldn't help but want to convert the silver into grain when he saw it. This had already become his instinctive reaction. But this time, when he saw the fist-sized silver ingots on the ground, Fang felt that his brain wasn't enough to process it. How much grain could this amount of silver buy was clearly beyond the scope of Fang's understanding, since his IQ was limited to adding and subtracting 10. Son-in-law, what did you do last night? Old Fang forcefully shifted his gaze away from the alluring silver ingots. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva with difficulty and looked at Li Yi as he asked. Li Yi glared at the careless maidservant girl and bent over to pick up the silver ingots on the ground one by one. He placed them in his bag and then raised his head to say, I got lost last night and picked them up on the road. Picked them up. Fang's voice was trembling. This was almost 100 taels of silver. He wouldn't be able to earn so much money in his entire life, yet it was so casually picked up by the son-in-law. Even if he earned 100 copper coins a day from selling candied haws for the past few days, and he could get half of it, it would take several years for him to save up so much money without eating or drinking. As for the young maidservant girl, her beautiful big eyes sparkled with little stars. The son-in-law's luck had always been good. Every time he went out, he would always pick up something. Although it had been a long time since he had picked up a pheasant, he had picked up so much silver this time. Even the heavens were helping the son-in-law. The young maiden's mood had experienced great ups and downs overnight. At this moment, her heart was filled with joy. She secretly looked at Li Yi and couldn't bear to look away. Seeing Li Yi and the others walk into the courtyard, Madame Wu stood there in a daze. She felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Until now, she still couldn't believe what she had just seen. That's a lot of shiny silver. She probably wouldn't be able to see so much silver in her next life. For those poor families who still had to fill their stomachs, their annual expenses were only about 1 tael of silver. That amount of silver was enough for them to spend for the rest of their lives. After an unknown amount of time, Madame Wu finally recovered from her daze. She picked up the copper basin from the ground and walked into the room in a daze with an unknown expression on her face. 100 taels of silver was not a small sum, and how to spend it was still a problem. Naturally, Li Yi would not be like Fong and the others. The first thing he thought of when he had money was to buy food. Under the situation where there was no shortage of food at home, what he needed to consider was of course how to make the most of the money, how to use the 100 taels of silver to make more money. After all, no one could guarantee that he would always meet a rich man like Prince Ning and his son. Silver was common, but tycoons were rare. If he wanted to earn enough money to enjoy his old age, he had to rely on himself. Originally, he wanted to slowly accumulate enough money through the candied haws, but changes often came faster than he planned. Now that he had some assets, he could obviously skip this step. However, the candied haws business still had to continue. At least in the short term, there was still a lot of profit to be made from the candied haws without any market competition. Of course, there was another important reason. Although the money was nothing to him, it was enough to change the lives of Fong and the others for the rest of their lives. Li Yi did not want to lead the entire village out of poverty and become rich, but Fong and the others were his people. He couldn't just watch them eat dirt while he lived a luxurious life. Li Yi's only dream at this stage was to earn money, a lot of money. At least, it would be enough for him to retire for the rest of his life. As for the specific amount of money, Li Yi did not have a number in his mind. In short, the more the better. With a starting capital of 100 taels, according to Li Yi's previous plan, he could consider purifying high alcohol content or making soap to make money. Before distillation and purification was invented, the alcohol content in this world was actually very low. Most of the rice wine was below 10 degrees, and the highest was no more than 20 degrees. It was only under this premise that it was possible to not get drunk after 1,000 cups. If it was the white wine with 50 to 60 degrees in the future, those so-called wine heroes would have died of alcohol poisoning many times before they could drink 1,000 cups. The alcohol content of the wine that the shopkeeper brought out last night should not be very high. How could it encounter someone like Li Yi who would faint at the slightest smell of alcohol? He was knocked out in one gulp after drinking it. The wine culture was also very prosperous in this world. The higher the alcohol content of the wine, the more they sought after it. Presumably, this would also be an unimpeded way to make money. The sterilization and disinfection of wounds also required high alcohol content. Li Yi still cherished his life very much. If a modern person died from an infected wound in the future, it would be a great shame. Apart from distilling the alcohol, the production of soap had to be put on the agenda as soon as possible. The legendary thing called pancreas, which was used for bathing, was also very rare in this world. Li Yi had specially looked for it in the market of the prefectural city, but he did not see anyone selling it. After asking, he found out that the production method of pancreas was very complicated. The secret recipe was also in the hands of the royal family and very few people. It was a luxury that only a few people could use, and it was basically impossible to see it in the market. Even if it did appear, it would be quickly bought at a high price. Something that couldn't be more ordinary in the future had immediately become a luxury in this world. This was naturally a good thing for Li Yi. In the past, he had also personally DIY handmade soap with the mentality of playing around. It did not require many materials, and the process was also not complicated. Even now, he still remembered the production method. The simplest handmade soap could be made with water, vegetable oil, and sodium hydroxide. The soap made with this method did not contain any additives, had a strong ability to remove dirt, and did not cause any harm to the human skin. Although there was no ready-made sodium hydroxide, it could be easily produced with slaked lime and soda ash. There was no difficulty. After thinking about it in his heart, Li Yi decided to start with handmade soap. He had really had enough of the days where he had to rely on his hands to bathe. As he was thinking about how to carry out this plan, he unknowingly walked into the inner courtyard. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound. Li Yi raised his head and saw a graceful figure moving around in the courtyard. A long sword that shone with a cold light was as agile as a snake. Seeing Lu Rui draw a beautiful flower with the sword and jump several feet away, Li Yi's heart was filled with extreme envy. If he could also have such skills, would he still be afraid of being bullied? If he encountered that scar-faced man again, he could easily deal with him by himself. At that time, with his extraordinary skills and pretty face, wouldn't he be able to become a handsome man with both the pen and the sword, easily gain a large group of female fans, and easily reach the peak of life? Looking at Li Yi's face from afar, Lu Rui sheathed his long sword and resisted the urge to kill him with one strike. Chapter 53. When he was young, Li Yi, like other boys, had dreams of being a wuxia. He had dreamed countless times that he could learn the best kung fu in the world and become a hero. He could fight against the strong and help the weak, travel the world with his sword, and leave a legend of chivalry in Jianghu. Especially after he came into contact with all kinds of wuxia novels and TV series, this idea became stronger and stronger. However, as he grew older, his thinking became less childish, and this idea gradually faded. In the 21st century, there was no wuxia Jianghu. As long as he was an adult with a normal brain, he would not always think about these illusory things like when he was young. But it was different here. In this world, Jianghu really existed. Although, wherever there are people, there is Jianghu, the definition of Jianghu here was very broad. But the Jianghu in this world was a real Jianghu with swords and heroes. Here, individual strength was extremely magnified. Even a small willow leaf village could be called a place with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Like Fong and the others, they looked like simple and honest farmers, but when they really fought with others, they were all good fighters who could fight against 10. Even his wife and sister-in-law were martial arts masters with extraordinary skills. Li Yi saw them practice kung fu every day, and the little tricks they showed inadvertently would make Li Yi's jaw drop. It was a piece of cake for them to break a wooden table with their bare hands. Li Yi felt that it would be no problem for Lu Rui to break a big stone on her chest. Thinking about it, he still felt that it was not suitable for her to practice. Her chest was already flat enough, and if it was pressed by the stone, there would be nothing left. Li Yi should be very lucky that Lu Rui could not hear what he was thinking, otherwise she would have already taken out her sword and hacked at him. After thinking carefully, Li Yi sadly found that in the whole family, in terms of fighting ability, he could only beat Xiao Huan. As a man, was there anything more shameful than this? No, in the family, there were more women than men. If he was not more domineering and powerful, he would be suppressed for the rest of his life. Rui, Li Yi looked at Lu Rui with a smile, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. Rui had never seen such an attitude from Li Yi, so he immediately raised his guard against him. He looked at him from afar and made a defensive posture. Li Yi's face darkened when he saw that he was about to make a move just because he called out her name. If not for the fact that he had a favor to ask, he really wanted to turn around and leave. What is it? Lu Rui looked at him and asked straightforwardly. I want to learn martial arts. This time, Li Yi didn't beat around the bush and answered straightforwardly. Practice martial arts? Lu Rui looked at him with a different expression. Why? Li Yi was stunned when he heard that, but he still said honestly, I just want to practice martial arts. I've admired martial artists since I was young, but I never had the chance to practice. No. To Li Yi's surprise, Lu Rui shook her head quickly. Why? It was his turn to be confused. Your aptitude is too low, Lu Rui said bluntly. Li Yi was stunned when he heard that, then he felt indignant. He was a transmigrator after all, and he had the halo of a protagonist. He was destined to be the man who changed the world, and he would succeed no matter what he did. He just wanted to practice martial arts, but he was told that his aptitude was too low. That didn't fit the plot of a protagonist at all. However, it was impossible for him to give up just like that. A thought flashed through his mind, and he looked at Lu Rui and said, why don't we make a bet? No. Lu Rui said straightforwardly, and Li Yi's words were stuck in his throat. Li Yi looked at her angrily. She always didn't play by the rules. Could they still have a pleasant conversation? If I lose, I'll give you 50 taels of silver. If you lose, you have to teach me martial arts. Li Yi didn't care whether she rejected it or not. He really didn't believe that Lu Rui could resist the temptation of 50 taels of silver. Sure enough, after hearing Li Yi's bet, Lu Rui raised her eyebrows, and she seemed to be tempted. 50 taels of silver was indeed not a small amount of money for her, and she could buy many things she wanted. She had never had so much money in her life. However, she also knew that since Li Yi said that, he must have the confidence to win. Based on her understanding of Li Yi, he wouldn't do things that he wasn't confident about. Li Yi knew what she was thinking at a glance. He smiled and said, "Don't worry. I won't ask you to recite poems or paint, and I won't ask you to do anything difficult." After saying that, he stood up and picked up 2 stones of different sizes from the corner of the yard. He held them in his hands and raised his arms to the same height. He looked at Lu Rui and said, "You just need to guess which of these 2 stones will fall first when I let go. If you guess right, I lose, and I'll give you the 50 taels of silver. If you guess wrong, you must fulfill your promise and teach me martial arts." The bet was very simple, but when Li Yi said it, Lu Rui still had some doubts in her heart. Of course, she didn't doubt herself, but she doubted Li Yi's intelligence. When 2 stones fell from the same height, it was common knowledge that the heavier one would fall first. Was there a need to bet? This bet was a situation where she would definitely win. If it wasn't for the elusive smile on Li Yi's face, Lu Rui would have suspected that he was really out of his mind and wanted to give her 50 taels of silver for nothing. She didn't worry that Li Yi would play any tricks. At such a close distance, no matter what Li Yi did, he wouldn't be able to escape her eyes. "What, do you dare to bet?" Li Yi looked at Lu Rui and said provocatively. "Why not?" Lu Rui glanced at him and said lightly. She couldn't lose this bet no matter what. Why would she go against the money? "Let's make a promise." Li Yi put down the stone and raised his hand. Clap. Lu Rui frowned, but she still reached out her hand and gave him a high five. "Let's begin. I'm guessing that the stone in your left hand will fall first." Lu Rui was referring to the bigger stone. "Don't rush." Li Yi didn't start immediately. He said with a serious face, "I have to get Xiao Huan to witness it. Otherwise, if you go back on your words, who am I going to talk to?" Lu Rui couldn't suppress the urge to slash him with her sword again. After a while, the servant girl stood beside them. She looked at Li Yi, then at Lu Rui and said, "Young master, second miss, we can start now." After that, she focused all her attention on Li Yi's hands. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. Young master's 50 taels of silver was probably going to be gone this time. Even Xiao Huan knew that the big stone would fall first. How could second miss be wrong? Watch carefully. Li Yi raised his arms to the same height and revealed an unnoticeable smile. He let go of his hands and the 2 stones fell to the ground. Bang! 2 stones fell from the sky and hit the bluestone slabs, making only a single sound. How is this possible? Upon seeing this scene, Lu Rui could not help but exclaim in astonishment. Chapter 54. That's impossible. Lu Rui's eyes widened. She was no longer as calm as before as she shook her head. The young maidservant beside her also opened her mouth in shock. She was not any less surprised than Lu Rui. When falling from the same height, a heavy object would definitely fall before a light object. This was a concept that had been deeply ingrained in their minds for more than 10 years. However, the 2 of them clearly saw that the 2 stones of different sizes had clearly fallen at the same time. "You must be cheating." Lu Rui looked up at Li Yi and said with certainty. "I knew you'd say that." Li Yi shrugged and said nonchalantly, "Try it yourself if you don't believe me." If the law of free fall could produce a different result from Lu Rui's hands, then it would not matter even if he lost 50 taels of silver to her. In another world, Aristotle once proposed the conclusion that heavier objects fall faster, with his enigmatic self-confidence, which dominated the Western academic world for nearly 2,000 years. One day 2,000 years later, Galileo walked up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa and threw 2 iron balls of different weights down. He proved the law of free fall with the 2 balls experiment. Similarly, in the current world, the principle that could be understood with a small experiment was also not discovered because of the ancient people's taken-for-granted concept. Lu Rui picked up another 2 stones to experiment with. When she saw the 2 stones fall to the ground at the same time in her hands, she was stunned. Then, she clenched her teeth and said, "Xiao Huan, try it." The reason why the law was a law was that it would not change due to objective conditions. Lu Rui was destined to fail if she wanted to challenge the law of nature. Why? Why is it like this? From afar, Li Yi felt a little guilty as he watched Lu Rui mutter those words in a daze. It was as though the worldview she had built up over a long period of time was beginning to crumble. Was it too despicable to use such a method to deceive a weak lady? No, his sister-in-law was not a weak woman. If such a woman could become a weak woman, then the world would have been ruled by women long ago. You lost the bet. Can you teach me martial arts now? Li Yi walked over and said to Lu Rui with a smile. Why? Lu Rui looked up at him and asked through gritted teeth, why did the 2 stones fall to the ground at the same time? For the current her, winning or losing was not important. What was important was that the creed that had existed in her heart over the years had undergone an earth-shattering change. She needed to know the reason behind it. Xiao Huan also stared wide-eyed at Li Yi, her big eyes filled with the light of curiosity. It was indeed difficult for Li Yi to explain the origin of the law of free fall. Basic physics had not yet been established in this world, and it would be even more troublesome to explain the knowledge of acceleration to them. He thought about it and said, you can think of it as saying that the speed of the falling stone has nothing to do with the weight of the stone. No matter how different the weight of the 2 stones is, if they fall from the same height, they will always hit the ground at the same time. This explanation was actually the same as no explanation at all. You only know part of it, don't you? After listening to Li Yi's explanation, Lu Rui looked at him with disdain. As a good young man who had received higher education, how could he be looked down upon by an ignorant woman in a feudal society? Li Yi looked at her and asked, do you know where the river flows from the back of the mountain? Nonsense, of course it flows down the mountain. Lu Rui said bluntly. Why? Li Yi looked at her and asked, why does the river always flow down the mountain and not up the mountain? Because. Lu Rui subconsciously opened her mouth to explain. However, the moment she said that word, she was unable to continue. Water flows from a high place to a low place. Was there a need for a reason? Li Yi's questions did not stop there. Why do the leaves on the tree always fall to the ground and not fly to the sky? Why can I see my own shadow in the water? Why are the colors of the rainbow after the rain always red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and purple? One question after another came out of Li Yi's mouth like a machine gun. Lu Rui opened her mouth for a moment and then closed it again. She was completely stunned. In autumn, the leaves on the tree would fall to the ground, one could see their own shadow in the water, and the order of the colors of the rainbow. Weren't these things natural? Did these need to be explained? But, why? Lu Rui and Xiao Huan stood in the courtyard and questions began to appear in their minds. Li Yi's words seemed to have opened the door to a new world for them. It turned out that these small things that they did not pay attention to were not as simple as they seemed. Even in the small things, there is a great knowledge hidden. And in this world, not every problem has an explanation. Li Yi felt a slight sense of achievement as he enlightened the 2 of them on natural science for free. Young master, why are these things? The little servant girl looked up at Li Yi and asked in a daze. Li Yi, since she was willing to bet, she had to be willing to accept her loss. Second Miss Lu's character was still very trustworthy. In the inner courtyard, Li Yi sat on a stone bench and looked at Lu Rui, who was obviously unhappy. He asked excitedly, do you know the 18 dragon subduing palms? What's the 18 dragon subduing palms? Lu Rui frowned and asked. It's the world's most ferocious palm technique. There's a dragon's roar when it's used. The wonders of the palm technique are unparalleled in the world. Li Yi explained with glowing eyes. I've never heard of it, Lu Rui said lightly. What about the six-pulse magical sword? Gather all the vital qi at the tip of the finger and release it through the air. It can seal the enemy's acupoints at close range and injure people with qi from afar. It's the world's top exquisite sword technique. I've never heard of it. Have you heard of the wave-like subtle steps? After mastering it, your body will be as light as a swallow. You can run on walls and walk on water. I've never heard of this either. Then you must have heard of Tai Chi. It's used to defeat the strong with the weak, overcome the strong with softness, complement each other with softness, borrow strength to fight strength, and move 1,000 pounds with little effort. After Li Yi finished, Lu Rui looked at him with a frown and said, I've never heard of anyone in Jianghu who has mastered the wonderful martial arts you mentioned. The 18 dragon subduing palms, the 6-pulse divine sword, the Tai Chi fist. According to what you said, even one of these supreme martial arts is enough to dominate Jianghu. However, no one in Jianghu can do any of them. Let's not talk about other things for now. Just the release of true qi alone is something that even a grandmaster expert would not be able to do. Ah, there's none of these? Li Yi's face showed an unconcealable disappointment. After all this time, the so-called martial arts masters in this world were not just a little bit different from the masters in old Master Jin's martial arts world. Where did you hear about these martial arts? Lu Rui looked up at him with a hint of doubt in her beautiful eyes. It's a long story, tell me about it for now. All right, Li Yi thought for a moment and said, it's said that in the Southern Song dynasty, in the last years of the previous dynasty, there were 5 supreme martial arts masters in Jianghu. They fought on the top of Mount Hua for the 9-yin manual, the world's best martial arts book. The battle lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, until the sun and the moon lost their light and the sky lost their color. Chapter 55. Under the warm autumn sun, the handsome scholar lazily reclined on a stone bench. His magnetic voice reverberated in the small courtyard. A story named The Legend of the Condor Heroes had been changed and its background had been reset. This was the first time that it had appeared in this world. 5 ultimate skills. Hua Mountain Sword Competition. 9-yin manual. As he continued to tell the story, the beautiful girl opposite him had an indifferent expression at first. After a while, her expression gradually changed, and she involuntarily fell into the wonderful story. She had been practicing martial arts since she was a child and had always been interested in the martial arts world. However, growing up in the village, she did not have the chance to come into contact with these things. She only heard a few words from other people, and she felt that the so-called Jianghu was nothing more than this. But at this moment, a real Jianghu that matched her expectations was taking shape in her mind and gradually spreading out. At a certain moment, another baby-faced girl walked out of the room and looked at them from afar. She murmured in a low voice, "Young master and second miss, what are they talking about?" A puzzled expression appeared on her pretty face, and she walked over curiously. After a long period of training, Li Yi's storytelling skills had been perfected. If he could no longer make a living in the future, other than moving a table to sell paintings on the street, he could also consider going to a theater to tell stories. Unknowingly, he had another way to make a living. In the Jianghu, it was not a burden to have more skills. Even Lu Rui, an otherworldly woman, could be attracted by him. She was attracted by the stories of old Master Jin, and this made his self-confidence a little inflated. Although Li Yi did not produce stories, and he was only a storyteller, who knew? Lu Rui had never heard of those exquisite martial arts, the martial arts gangs that she had never heard of, and even the names of the top masters in the stories. Although the previous dynasty was decades ago, it was not like Lu Rui did not understand it. The situation of the world back then was different from what Li Yi had revealed. If that was the case, he had fabricated everything out of thin air. However, even though he clearly knew nothing about martial arts, some of his deductions had clearly reached a very profound realm. It even made her feel enlightened. Occasionally, she was enlightened, and her martial arts cultivation even showed signs of advancing to the next level. That's all for today. When are you going to teach me martial arts? The Legend of the Condor Heroes wasn't something that could be finished in a day. Even if he could read the original version in his mind, he would get bored after a long time. Let's talk about this in a few days. Although Rui was still very curious about the development of the story, the most important thing at the moment was to digest those insights. He waved his hand at Li Yi impatiently and hurried back to his room. You, Li Yi looked at her back in a daze. She left after listening to the story. Didn't she say that she was willing to admit defeat? Burning the bridge after crossing the river, getting rid of the donkey when it was no longer of use. What kind of people were these? In the end, Lu Rui did not leave Li Yi alone. She casually threw him a book about the basics of martial arts and let him practice by himself. Having such an irresponsible sister-in-law, Li Yi couldn't do anything about it. Fortunately, he could absorb the books in the real world into his mind. After absorbing this basic martial art, he could quickly master the moves inside. However, it was just the form and nothing more. The might of these moves could only be revealed when paired with a unique mental cultivation method. Furthermore, it required vigorous inner energy as a foundation. Only having moves but no inner energy in one's body could only be regarded as a superficial display. If one encountered a slightly more powerful opponent, this little bit of skill would not be enough. Unfortunately, the cultivation of inner qi could not be achieved overnight. It could only be accumulated over a long period of time and slowly increased. This made Li Yi's dream of becoming a top master in a short period of time become a bubble. Even so, his learning ability still shocked Lu Rui. She still remembered that it took her a whole month to completely master these basic moves. On the other hand, Li Yi only used less than a day. In terms of the degree of control, he seemed to be more skillful than she was at that time. The difference between a day and a month was like the difference between heaven and earth. This made Lu Rui suffer a huge blow. She could not help but have some doubts in her heart. Could it be that he was really a martial arts genius that appeared once in a century? In terms of poetry and painting, she was definitely not as good as Li Yi. However, Li Yi did not know martial arts. This was one of the few things that Lu Rui could find confidence in from him, but now, she did not even have this confidence anymore. If Li Yi knew what Lu Rui was thinking, he would probably be very proud. However, he could not be proud at this moment. There was no other reason. Since the beginning of autumn, the number of mosquitoes in the room had increased. Unless he kept hiding in the gauze curtains, his exposed skin would be bitten into big bumps after a while. It was not a big deal to be bitten by mosquitoes. It was not that Li Yi had not been bitten by mosquitoes before. However, he did not know the physique of this body that he had transmigrated to. When others were bitten, there would at most be a small red dot or a small bump. However, when Li Yi was bitten, there would immediately be a big bump on that area. It was extremely itchy and unbearable. In the evening, he did not dare to step into the room anymore. He sat on a stone not far from the door. Because of the wind outside, there were no mosquitoes. In this backward era, mosquito-repellent incense had not been invented yet. The most common way to repel mosquitoes was to hang a sachet in the room. The sachet was filled with mosquito-repellent herbs such as agastache, peppermint, basil, calamus, citronella, and so on. Li Yi had also tried this method, but the effect was not obvious. Moreover, Li Yi himself could not stand the smell. He was afraid that before the mosquitoes were smoked away, Li Yi himself would be suffocated to death. If only there was a bottle of 6 Gods floral water. At this moment, Li Yi missed the mosquito-repellent artifact from his previous life. People always know how to cherish things after they have lost them. A box of mosquito-repellent incense and a bottle of floral water could help him get out of the sea of suffering, but this small request could only be extravagant hope. By the way, if there is no ready-made one, I can make it myself. After a while, Li Yi patted his head and said in sudden realization. His head was filled with books from the entire provincial library. Would he be afraid of not being able to find the formula for the mosquito repellent? Chemistry. Lifestyle. The next moment, Li Yi's consciousness sank into his mind. His eyes swept across the rows of bookshelves, and pieces of messy information poured into his mind. After an unknown amount of time, Li Yi suddenly slapped his thigh and exclaimed, "Found it." It was also at this moment that the sound of footsteps came into his ears. When he raised his head, he saw Fang's familiar face. "What's wrong? Were you beaten by your wife again?" Seeing the unconcealable sadness on Fang's face, Li Yi temporarily forgot about the mosquito repellent and asked. Chapter 56. In fact, Fang's wife could be regarded as a strange woman. She usually looked like a simple peasant woman, but when she beat up old Fang, she immediately became a heroine of the generation. Li Yi could feel the thick murderous aura from her even from afar. Although Lao Fang seemed to be troubled by something today, there were no bruises on his face. Presumably, it wasn't because of his fierce wife at home. Fang shook his head, indicating that he got along well with his wife at home today, and sat down next to Li Yi. "Then there is something wrong with the Tanghulu business." Li Yi slapped a mosquito that had just landed on his arm and said, "What's wrong? Are there already many people on the street who are imitating our candied haws? How did you know?" Fang suddenly jumped up from the ground and looked at Li Yi in surprise, as if he had seen a ghost. Li Yi flicked away the dead mosquito in his hand and pointed to the front. Fang looked in the direction of his finger and saw several people carrying Tanghulu on their shoulders passing by. When passing by, they looked at Li Yi and Fang a few times, and there was no lack of complacency on their faces. "Bah!" Fang spat at the backs of these people and scolded, "Shameless guys." This idea was obviously the son-in-law's idea. Why did they also sell Tanghulu? If there was a patent in this world, Fang would have long been unable to help but go to the government to sue them. These people were the direct descendants of Lu's family. At first, they looked down on Fang and the others for not doing the right thing and taking the crooked way to sell Tanghulu. But later, they saw that their lives were getting richer and richer, and even found that Fang's children had become stronger after a few days. Only then did they realize that what Fang and the others were doing was really a money-making job. No one would say no to money. Those who had secretly despised Fang and the others before began to imitate them in a few days and began to sell Tanghulu. The method of making Tanghulu was really simple, and one could understand it with a few glances. Therefore, there were several Tanghulu workshops in the stockade overnight. Although they did not learn some of Li Yi's unique skills, it would not affect them too much if their taste was a little worse. Fang was extremely resentful of their shameless behavior. But he could only be angry. After all, there was no law in the Jing kingdom that clearly prohibited them from selling Tanghulu, which was also what made Fang depressed. "I'm afraid that they are not the only ones who imitate them, right?" Li Yi asked again. Fang looked at Li Yi with a surprised look again. He knew what was going on in the world without going out. He felt that Li Yi was more and more mysterious. He nodded and said, "Since a few days ago, there have been more people selling Tanghulu on the street. Previously, we could sell all of our Tanghulu in less than 2 hours. But today, after shouting for a whole day, there are still half of them left." The Tanghulu business carried Fang's lofty dream, beautiful wives, and a big house. Now, his hope was mercilessly extinguished just as it sprouted. The bitterness was really indescribable. Such a situation was not out of Li Yi's expectation. On the contrary, these things were all within his expectations. Never underestimate the ability of human beings to imitate, not to mention the Tanghulu business, which did not require much technical content. After seeing the business opportunity, it was not strange that so many people would follow the trend. Li Yi did not intend to do the Tanghulu business for the rest of his life. But so far, there was still a lot of profit in this area. He looked up at the man surnamed Fang, sighed and said, "Fang, how many times have I said that you can't do things recklessly? You have to use your brain. Not only can you not marry a beautiful concubine, but you also can't buy a big house for the rest of your life." Fang's face turned red. He looked around and did not find his wife. He glared and said, "Who wants to marry a concubine? My wife is enough." It seemed that it was impossible to count on Fang to use his brain to think of a solution. Li Yi waved to him helplessly and said, "Come here. Next, you have to do this." Fang was overjoyed and hurriedly put his ear to it. After a while, Fang looked at Li Yi with a dull face and could not say a word for a long time. Looking at Li Yi and then at himself, Fang began to have a question in his heart. They were all born and raised by their parents, but why was there such a big difference between them? "I think the son-in-law is not a good person." Thinking of what Li Yi had said to him just now, Fang gave Li Yi a thumbs up with admiration. "Get out." Li Yi kicked Fang's butt. Even when this guy praises people, he is so unique. In the next few days, many people in the stockade had already taken selling tanghulu as their main business. However, after a few days, everyone found that the tanghulu business was getting more and more difficult. There was no other reason than the number of vendors selling tanghulu increased day by day. They could be seen on every street in Qing and Prefecture. Under such fierce competition and the fact that their candied haws weren't that outstanding, their business naturally worsened. In the end, they could only sell a few skewers a day. Then, at some unknown time, the number of vendors selling tanghulu suddenly decreased at an alarming rate. This was because they could no longer buy hawthorn fruits. When they asked the hawthorn peddlers, they learned that just a few days ago, all the hawthorn in the entire Qing and prefectural city had been bought by someone at a low price. In other words, they wouldn't be able to find hawthorn to make candied haws in the short term. This situation did not continue for long. Just 2 days later, a few hawthorn vendors suddenly appeared in the city. Naturally, it quickly caused a commotion among the crowd. Although the price of these hawthorn fruits was more than 3 times higher than before, after they were made into tanghulu, there was still a certain amount of profit to be made. The crowd cursed the simple and honest-looking men in their hearts for first stocking up and then taking the opportunity to raise the price of the hawthorn fruits. However, they could only grit their teeth and buy. After all, this was already the only place in the city that sold hawthorn fruits. However, because of this, the competition between these people also increased. Ever since the first person began to lower the price in order to sell more, the price of tanghulu plummeted until 1 copper coin could buy a skewer of tanghulu. The profits in this business had also reached a freezing point. It was also at this time that a new type of tanghulu suddenly appeared in the city and once again caused a rush to buy it. The raw material of this tanghulu was not hawthorn, but fresh, seasonal fruit. It was cut into small pieces, coated with icing sugar, and then skewered. It was even more delicious than the tanghulu made from hawthorn. This type of loose tanghulu quickly opened up a market in Qing and Prefecture. Those who were observant noticed that the first tanghulu to appear in the city came from the hands of these people. And in terms of taste, their tanghulu was a notch better than the other vendors. This was a kind of brand effect. Even though there were others who imitated the new style of candied haws, it was difficult for them to pose a threat to the Lu family's candied haws. Their simple and honest faces seemed to have become the symbol of authentic candied haws in Qing'an Prefecture. Creak. Li Yi had just finished teaching the naughty children. Not long after he returned home, the door to the small courtyard was pushed open from the outside. Fang and a few men walked in with smiles on their faces. Chapter 57. Fang took out a big bag from his back and said, "Son-in-law, this is the money we've earned from selling red fruits and candied haws these days. According to our initial agreement, we'll split it in half. This is the remaining half." It had to be said that Fang and the others were a group of very honest people. Although they were the ones who worked hard to sell candied haws, the candied haws were invented by Li Yi. In the beginning, he was the one who gave them the money. Even when they encountered various problems later on, he was the one who helped them solve them. Without Li Yi, they wouldn't be where they were today. They understood all this. Son-in-law could have done these things without them, but because of his relationship with Miss, he took care of them. Everything was remembered by Fong and the others. At first, when they heard that son-in-law wanted to split half of the profits with them, Fong and the others were shocked at first, then they became terrified. They had only done a little bit of work. What right did they have to take so much? However, they insisted on only taking 10% of the profits, which was eventually rejected by Li Yi. Fong could never imagine that the reason why Li Yi's impression of him changed was because of the two pheasants. Perhaps, all of them should be grateful to the two pheasants. In the courtyard, when Xiao Huan and Lu Rui saw Fong open the bag and revealed the copper coins inside, their pretty faces went blank for a moment. They knew that it was Li Yi's idea that the big man surnamed Fong and the others had been working on the candied haws business these days. They were only a little curious, but they didn't take it to heart. Last time, Fong sent a small bag of copper coins to Xiao Huan, saying that it was the profit from selling candied haws. It was about a few hundred copper coins. At that time, Xiao Huan only thought that son-in-law had found a way to make money for Uncle Fong and the others, and they wouldn't have to live so hard in the future. She was very happy. But she didn't expect that they would make so much money in just a few days. If they only sold candied haws like before, they naturally wouldn't make so much money. But what Xiao Huan and Lu Rui didn't know was that Fong and the others had been doing more than this these days. First, he listened to Li Yi and bought a large amount of hawthorns, almost emptying out the hawthorns in Qing and prefectural city. A few days later, he sold them at several times the original price and made a huge profit. Not only that, but even the unripened hawthorn fruits in the back of the mountain were all plucked by them, taking advantage of this craze to sell. More than half of the copper coins in front of him were actually the profits from selling hawthorn fruits. In addition, they took advantage of the fact that the price of the hawthorn sugar-coated haws had dropped to the freezing point and there was no longer any profit to be made. They decisively launched a new type of fruit sugar-coated haws, which was well received. Before all the vendors could react, they had made a fortune. All of this was, of course, Li Yi's idea. And now, although there were many imitations of the new type of sugar-coated haws, because they had long established the loose sugar-coated haws brand, they had a natural advantage. Their business was still very good, and every day, their goods would be sold out. Until now, there was a steady income every day. If this business could continue for a long time, their lives would definitely get better and better. They didn't have to go back to the days where they had to worry about filling their stomachs every day. They had meat and rice every day, and their family gradually had a small amount of savings. In a short period of time, they had suddenly moved from the bottom of the willow leaf village to a well-off level. Not to mention the tenant farmers who used to be at the same level as them, even the direct descendants of the Lus who had a slightly more well-off life were now far behind them. Who could have imagined such a life in the past? Because of this, these people were full of gratitude towards Li Yi. If it weren't for him, they might still be working for others and living a life where they didn't know the next meal. Have you bought all the things that I asked you to buy in the prefecture? Li Yi didn't refuse the money sent by Fong and the others. After all, in the following period of time, he really needed money. I've bought all the bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices, and wine. I'll send them to you in a moment. Fong nodded and said. Although he was still very curious about the use of those things that the son-in-law asked him to buy, now Fong admired Li Yi from the bottom of his heart. The things that needed to be done would be done by the son-in-law. As for the rest, he could leave it to him. By the way, there's one more thing. Li Yi looked up at Fong and the others and said, the sugar-coated haws business can be handed over to your in-laws in the future. If you have any trustworthy relatives, you can also let them participate. Hearing this, Fong was stunned and asked, then what should we do? The others also had a puzzled look on their faces. Don't worry, I won't let you guys be idle, Li Yi said with a smile. Letting Fong and the others sell sugar-coated haws on the streets was really overkill. It was a great waste of talent. What Li Yi was going to do next would be the time where they would really be useful. Although Li Yi didn't explain in detail, Fong still nodded without hesitation. All right, I'll let my in-laws know when I get back. The others didn't have any objections to this. This powerful execution that stemmed from trust left Lu Rui secretly alarmed as she watched from the side. He turned his head and looked at Li Yi with a surprised expression. He had only been in the village for a short period of time, but he had already completely convinced these guys. Not long after, the burly man surnamed Fong and the others walked out of the courtyard. Walking in the village, along the way, many of the direct descendants of the Lu family looked at them with rather unfriendly eyes. There was no other reason, it was because their sugar-coated haws had all gone bankrupt. Nowadays, an ordinary sugar-coated haw could only be sold for a copper coin. The profits were far less than before. Even if it was a copper coin, they couldn't sell much in a day. In the current Qing and prefecture, the faces of Fong and the others were the only indication of authentic sugar-coated haws. Only the Lu family's sugar-coated haws were still as popular as before. Of course, compared to others, their sugar-coated haws had more variety and the taste was more delicious. This was also the reason why the Lu family's sugar-coated haws had always been popular. As for the Lu family's sugar-coated haws, of course, it wasn't a name that just anyone with the surname Lu could use. Even though they wanted to imitate it, the taste they made was far from the others. It was only now that everyone understood that this seemingly simple sugar-coated haw probably had some unique secret method that they didn't know about. If they wanted to make a fortune with sugar-coated haws, they had to get Fong's secret recipe. However, the direct descendants had always been at odds with each other. Of course, Fong wouldn't tell them the secret recipe for free. Seeing that the people they didn't even need to look at when they went out in the past were now living a life that even they were envious of, more of the Lu family members began to regret. If they hadn't been so against Lu's sister Rui, how could this situation have happened? Back then, for the sake of a small profit, they had made things difficult for the Lu sisters. Now, they had lost this rare opportunity to make a fortune. Only the Lu family members could understand how they felt. At this moment, their minds once again thought of the scholar that they had looked down upon. Everyone's hearts were filled with complicated emotions. Chapter 58. Son-in-law, take a look. Did you miss anything? Fong walked in from the outside carrying a large bag, took out the things inside, and placed them in front of Li Yi. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices, a few jars of wine that old Fong had bought from the prefecture city. Looking at the pile of items in front of him, Li Yi counted them and nodded. Old Fong was very reliable. He did not miss out on any of the items that he had been instructed to buy. As the autumn deepened, the mosquitoes became even more rampant when night fell. For this body with a special physique, every night was the most torturous time for Li Yi. Now that the candied haw's business was on the right track, Fong and a few others could handle it. There was no need for Li Yi to worry more. He finally had time to solve the biggest problem that troubled him. Son-in-law, it's not New Year's Day. Why did you buy so much wine? Fong's gaze was fixed on the wine jar on the ground. He involuntarily swallowed a mouthful of saliva and looked at Li Yi. In the past, when the family had no money, there were only a few times a year when they were willing to spend a few coins to buy a bowl of wine at the wine shop in the market at the foot of the mountain to satisfy their cravings. The taste was enough to be remembered for several days. Although he did not have to worry about food and clothing these days and had a lot of surplus, Fong, who was afraid of poverty, was still very thrifty in life. It was easy to earn copper money, but it was harder for him to spend it. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be extravagant enough to enjoy wine and meat all day long. Who said it's not New Year's Day? Li Yi raised his eyebrows, looked back at Fong, and said, "Isn't it the Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days? These days, I have been busy with the candied haw's business. Everyone has worked hard. I will reward everyone." When Fong heard this, his eyes suddenly lit up. "Is this wine for the Mid-Autumn Festival?" "No." Li Yi said very simply. This wine was used to make floral water to repel mosquitoes. He could not let Fong spoil it. Fong's expression froze, and he was speechless for a moment. Ignoring the bitterness in Fong's eyes, Li Yi opened his mouth again and said, "Go find some iron pots and some empty bamboo tubes." We're about to start working. Li Yi originally wanted to postpone the purification of the alcohol for a while and make the soap first. However, his plans could not keep up with the changes, so he had to put the purification of the alcohol first. There was no other reason. To make a mosquito-repellent floral water, it was necessary to use a high concentration of alcohol. Fong was very efficient. He found the iron pot very quickly. Under Li Yi's guidance, it took him half a day to build the alcohol distillation device. Distilling alcohol was not as simple as heating it in a pot. If the temperature was too high, the alcohol and water would evaporate together. After condensing, the alcohol would still be of a low concentration, and it would not be purified. This was a simple distillation device. It first heated the water and used the water temperature to evaporate the alcohol. The alcohol vapor condensed above and entered the bamboo tube. What flowed out was the purified alcohol. Li Yi could easily find the schematic diagram of the distillation device in the book, but the equipment such as flasks and glass tubes could not be realized at present. In desperation, he could only settle for the next best thing and replace it with these simple things in front of him. Although the effect would definitely be a lot worse, as long as he could get alcohol with a concentration of more than 75%, it would be enough. After all the preparations were done, Li Yi ignited the flame below. The next thing to do was to wait. Fong scratched his head. He looked at Li Yi for a while, and then looked at the strange thing his son-in-law asked him to make. His brain was a mess. As drops of wine flowed out of the hollow bamboo tube, gradually, the kitchen began to fill with a strong wine aroma. Gulp. Fong swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Li Yi turned his head and glanced at him. Fong immediately wiped the corner of his mouth and looked away from the bowl under the bamboo tube, pretending that nothing had happened. When the speed of the wine flowing out of the bamboo tube became extremely slow, Li Yi knew that the wine in the pot was almost distilled. He took out a chopstick and dipped it into the bowl. After tasting it, he frowned slightly. Although the alcohol content after distilling was much higher than before, it still did not meet his requirements. It seems that this distillation device is still too simple. If I want to produce it on a large scale in the future and increase the efficiency, I need to improve the distillation device. Li Yi murmured. He poured all the distilled wine into an empty jar and replaced it with fresh wine for the second distillation. Smelling the fragrance in the air, Fong's throat kept trembling. He wanted to pick up the jar next to him and drink to his heart's content. However, he thought that this wine would definitely be of great use to his son-in-law, so he restrained this thought. The alcohol content after distilling was far from enough. The device was simple and crude, and he had to make up for the number of times. Li Yi repeated the distillation over and over again. This way, the alcohol content would increase a little every time. According to the book, using the distillation method to distill alcohol could only achieve a maximum alcohol concentration of about 95%. Of course, it was impossible for Li Yi to achieve such a high alcohol concentration with a few broken pots, but 80% was enough for him. After repeated distillation a few times, Li Yi found that the alcohol content did not increase much. Only then did he give up. Gulp. Fong, who was beside him, swallowed a mouthful of saliva again. Glancing at Fong, Li Yi really could not stand it anymore. He divided a small bowl of distilled alcohol and handed it to him. All right, don't be greedy. Have a taste of this wine. Hearing this, Fong's eyes lit up. After taking the bowl, he couldn't wait to drink it. Li Yi watched as Fong's face turned from black to red. He let out a comfortable moan. The expression on his face was extremely satisfied. He said loudly, "Good wine." Plop. After saying these two words, Fong's body swayed a few times and fell to the ground, unconscious. Looking at Fong, who was lying on the ground and snoring, Li Yi could not help but feel some contempt in his heart. This guy looked so strong, but it turned out that he was also an embroidered pillow. One gulp and he was not much stronger than himself. Putting the distilled alcohol to the tip of his nose and smelling it, a spicy smell rushed straight into his lungs. In just an instant, Li Yi felt a little dizzy, he quickly moved the wine bowl away. At this time, he realized that the alcohol in front of him was more than 75% alcohol concentration. In the previous world, alcohol with a concentration higher than 60% seemed to be prohibited from being sold in the country. Looking down at Fong, who was lying on the ground, Li Yi could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. "You're already an adult, but you still can't resist the temptation. You deserve it." Chapter 59. Fong was carried back to his home by Li Yi's men. When he was carried away, he kept muttering, "Good wine." Li Yi clearly noticed that the two men's eyes lit up when they smelled the wine on Fong. At that time, Li Yi mocked Fong a little in his heart, but it didn't take long for him to regret it. He really shouldn't have tricked Fong into drinking the wine. That was a high concentration of more than 75% alcohol. If he didn't sleep until tomorrow morning, it was estimated that Fong wouldn't wake up. If he didn't wake up, Li Yi would have to do the next work alone. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices. Grind all of these things into powder, then put the distilled alcohol in a porcelain bottle and mixed it with the ground powder. Then, shake the porcelain bottle continuously to ensure that they were mixed well. Both bezoar and honeysuckle had the effect of clearing heat and detoxifying. The function of mint was mainly used to repel mosquitoes. As for those spices, of course, it was to make the scent of the floral water smell better. This was a simple preparation method of floral water that Li Yi found in the book. In terms of effect, it was certainly not comparable to the big brands such as Lucien or Longlicky in the future, but Li Yi's requirements were not high, as long as the mosquito repellent effect was okay. According to the book, the concentration of 75% alcohol was mixed with powdered bezoar, honeysuckle, peppermint, and so on, and then kept shaking for half an hour. After they were fully mixed, the residue was filtered out, and the simple floral water was successfully prepared. Thus, when the servant girl came to the kitchen, she saw the son-in-law holding a porcelain bottle in his hand. He looked as if he was possessed, shaking it back and forth. "Son-in-law, what's wrong with you?" The little maid ran over in a hurry and looked at Li Yi with eyes full of worry. If the son-in-law was really possessed, what could he do? Even an Iron Man would not be able to withstand such a long period of shaking. Just as Li Yi was feeling a little dizzy and nauseous, Xiao Huan's figure appeared at the right time. "Xiao Huan, come here quickly and help me shake this bottle." With Xiao Huan's help, he could finally rest for a while. Li Yi looked at the little maid who stood there shaking the porcelain bottle stupidly and did not know what had happened. He thought to himself that when he prepared the floral dew on a large scale in the future, he had to think of a reliable way to ensure that they were fully integrated. It was not a long-term solution to hold the bottle and shake it every time. The two of them took turns, and after about half an hour, Li Yi estimated that it was about time. He pulled out the cork and passed the liquid inside the bottle through a piece of clean gauze to remove the undissolved residue. After the filtration, a translucent liquid was obtained. At the same time, a familiar fragrance began to fill the room. "Young master, what is this? It smells so good." The young maidservant widened her eyes and looked at Li Yi in surprise. "It seems that there are a little too many spices. Next time, reduce the amount by 1/3. Li Yi murmured and put the first successfully prepared floral dew in a new porcelain bottle. The first preparation of floral dew was relatively successful. Although there were inevitably some flaws, as long as he did a few more experiments, he would always be able to find the most suitable formula. Li Yi could not wait to experiment with the efficacy of the floral dew he prepared. "Xiao Huan, hurry up and boil water. I want to take a bath later." "Yes, young master." The young maidservant looked at the strange thing in the kitchen with some doubts and looked at the back of Li Yi, who left with some joy. Her heart was full of curiosity. What did the son-in-law come up with this time? He poured some floral dew into the bathtub and took a comfortable hot bath. He immediately felt refreshed and his body exuded a faint fragrance. In order to verify the mosquito repellent effect, Li Yi stayed in the corner of the room with the most mosquitoes for a while. The mosquitoes that were willing to be intimate with him were really much less than before. Success. Seeing the mosquito-repellent effect of floral dew, Li Yi's face showed joy. This showed that the method of using floral dew to repel mosquitoes was feasible. Next time, he could add more mosquito-repellent herbs like peppermint to get floral dew with a stronger mosquito-repellent effect. Similarly, if he modified the formula and thought more about the spices, wouldn't the end result be perfume? This was simply killing two birds with one stone. However, for the promotion of floral dew and perfume in this world, Li Yi still did not have much confidence in his heart at this time. In the past, he had read many time travel novels. The protagonists invented various modern items in the ancient world with knowledge that was hundreds and thousands of years ahead of the ancients. They were very popular with the ancients. They counted money until their hands cramped. They had beautiful wives and concubines, big houses, groups of servants, and lived a luxurious and extravagant life. However, Li Yi, who had real experience, deeply understood that reality was far more painful than ideals. Some things were very simple to think about, but when it was really realized, all kinds of difficulties would come one after another. What he needed to do now was to improve the alcohol purification device as much as possible. If the efficiency of each distillation was as low as the first time, it would never work. In addition, he also needed to build a separate processing workshop. After all, he couldn't always do it in his own kitchen. Moreover, after the scale of production was expanded, the small space in the kitchen was far from meeting the requirements. Fortunately, Li Yi still needed some time to improve the distillation equipment and improve the formula. The construction of the workshop was not so urgent. What's more, the location of the workshop, how to build it, and how to operate it after it was built had to be decided after careful consideration. Of course, Li Yi couldn't do these things alone. Therefore, he asked Fang and the others to get out of the candied haws business as soon as possible. Just by selling a few sticks of candied haws, Fang's dream of marrying a concubine and buying a village would probably only be realized in his next life. Li Yi felt that he was born to work hard. He was living a good life as the husband of the village. He had food, drinks, and maids to serve him every day. His life was extremely comfortable. However, he had to look for trouble and lead Fang and the others to a well-off life. He obviously yearned for a pig's life, but in the end, he was as tired as a dog. This was all his own doing. When he walked out of the room, he saw the little maid sitting in the yard. She pouted and kept scratching the mosquito bite on her arm. Hearing the son-in-law calling her from a distance at the door, the girl hurriedly stood up, turned her head and asked, "Son-in-law, what's the matter?" Come here," he waved to the little maid and brought her into the room. He poured some floral water on his hand and wiped it on the mosquito bite on her arm. He asked, "How do you feel? Is it still itchy?" "No, it's not itchy anymore." The afterglow of the setting sun shone into the room through the window. The little maid rolled up her sleeves, revealing her white arms. She lowered her head and spoke softly. Her pretty face was rosy and beautiful. You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.